At exactly 11 o'clock, on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the guns finally fell silent. But what most people never realize is that the war did not truly begin with gunfire. It did not end when the noise stopped. It began years earlier, in crowded cities and royal courts, in whispered alliances, in rivalries passed down through generations, and in decisions made by men who believed the next war would be short, glorious, and controllable. Instead, it became something the world had never seen before. A war where millions would die without ever seeing the enemy, where entire landscapes were erased, where time itself seemed to break inside muddy trenches, and where survival became a matter of minutes, not heroism. Boys left home believing they would be back by Christmas. Many never came back at all. Empires that had ruled for centuries collapsed in a matter of months. Borders were torn apart and redrawn, with careless lines on maps, and the consequences of those lines would echo for the rest of the century. This is not just the story of battles and generals. This is the story of how the modern world was born in smoke, wire, and blood, how hope marched confidently into war and came out shattered, and how a single summer in 1914 set humanity on a path it has never truly escaped. Stay with this story, because by the time it ends, you'll realize the world you live in today was shaped here, in the mud, the silence, and the millions of lives that never returned home. Chapter 1. A World on the Brink. Europe before the storm. The train whistles scream across the night air, metal wheels shrieking as they grind against the rails, carrying young men in pressed uniforms toward borders they have never seen and wars they cannot yet imagine. Crowds cheer from the platforms, flags wave, bands play patriotic songs, and for a moment it feels like celebration. But beneath the music, beneath the smiles, something darker stirs. This moment, this confidence, this belief that history is under control is already a lie. The war that will come is not an accident. It is the final crack in a world that has been quietly breaking for more than 40 years. In the year 1871, cannon fire echoes across Europe not as a warning, but as a declaration. The German states, once divided and suspicious of one another, are unified through blood and iron. In the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, surrounded by French humiliation and German triumph, a new empire is proclaimed. The German Empire is born powerful, disciplined, and hungry for recognition. Almost simultaneously, Italy completes its own unification, pulling together fragmented kingdoms into a single nation that demands respect among Europe's great powers. To many, these events signal progress, order, and stability. To others, they are the beginning of a dangerous imbalance. For centuries, Europe's power had been carefully distributed. Empires rose slowly and fell just as slowly. But Germany changes everything. It is young, industrial, and efficient, its factories humming, its railways stretching like steel veins across the continent. Coal smoke hangs over its cities, carrying the scent of progress and ambition. Steel pours from its furnaces. Its army drills relentlessly, boots striking the ground in perfect rhythm. Older empires watch with growing unease. France still remembers the humiliation of defeat. Britain sees a rival rising on the continent. Russia senses pressure along its western borders. Austria-Hungary feels its fragile unity beginning to strain. Peace remains, but it is no longer natural. It must be managed, enforced, guarded. Europe becomes a room filled with people holding loaded weapons, all convinced that safety lies in being ready to fire first. This is the age of militarism, where armies are no longer a last resort, but a symbol of national strength. Military parades become common. Generals gain political influence. War plans are drawn up in meticulous detail, timed to the minute, as if conflict were a train schedule rather than a human catastrophe. Nations begin to believe that if war is inevitable, then striking fast and decisively is the only rational choice. At the same time, nationalism spreads like a fever. It is not just pride in one's country. It is the belief that identity itself is sacred, that language, culture, and blood define destiny. In France, the loss of Alsace-Lorraine becomes a wound that never heals. Schoolchildren learn maps that mark the territory as stolen land. In Germany, unity fuels confidence and entitlement. In Eastern Europe and the Balkans, nationalism becomes something even more dangerous. There, empires rule over dozens of ethnic groups, each with its own history and grievances. Slavic peoples dream of independence. Hungarians resent Vienna. Serbs imagine a greater nation carved from imperial rule. Every dream of freedom is also a threat to someone else's survival. Empires stretch across continents, and rivalry follows them overseas. Britain, France, Germany, and others scramble for colonies in Africa and Asia, driven by raw materials, prestige, and fear of falling behind. Maps are redrawn with rulers and pens, borders cutting through villages, tribes, and trade routes without regard for the people who live there. In Berlin, London, and Paris, these distant lands feel abstract, like pieces on a game board. But each colonial crisis adds tension back home. A confrontation in Morocco, a standoff in Africa, a naval race in the North Sea. Every incident tightens the knot. The arms race accelerates. Battleships grow larger, guns longer, armor thicker. Britain launches a new class of warship that renders all others obsolete overnight, forcing rivals to follow or fall behind. On land, artillery becomes heavier, machine guns faster, rifles more accurate. Railways are expanded not just for commerce, but for mobilization, allowing millions of men to be moved toward borders in days. War is no longer imagined as a brief clash between professionals. It is planned as an industrial effort, drawing entire societies into its machinery. To protect themselves, nations form alliances, binding their fates together through promises meant to deter aggression. On paper, these treaties are defensive. In reality, they create a trap. Germany aligns with Austria-Hungary. France binds itself to Russia. Britain, long committed to staying aloof from continental entanglements, quietly draws closer to France and Russia as German power grows. Each alliance is like a rope tied between climbers on a mountain. It feels safe until one person slips. Then everyone is dragged down together. Diplomacy becomes a performance of confidence and threat. Leaders speak of peace while preparing for war. Crises erupt and are narrowly diffused, each one reinforcing the belief that the system works, that catastrophe can always be avoided at the last moment. But every escape teaches the wrong lesson. It convinces governments that they can push a little further next time, that risk is manageable, that opponents will back down again. Nowhere is the danger greater than in the Balkans. The region is a crossroads of empires and ambitions, where Ottoman decline leaves a vacuum and Austria-Hungary struggles to maintain control. The air there feels tense, heavy with resentment and hope. In cafes and classrooms, young men talk about freedom, sacrifice, and destiny. Secret societies form in the shadows, passing weapons and oaths hand to hand. To Vienna, the Balkans are a problem to be managed. To nationalists, they're the future waiting to be seized. Austria-Hungary itself is a fragile construction, held together by tradition and fear. Dozens of ethnic groups live under one crown, each pulling in a different direction. The empire's leaders know that weakness invites collapse. They believe strength must be shown, authority enforced, dissent crushed quickly and decisively. But every act of repression deepens resentment. Every display of power reveals anxiety beneath the surface. Across Europe, ordinary people live in the shadow of forces they barely understand. Factory workers breathe cold dust and machine oil, laboring long hours to fuel economies that promise prosperity but deliver exhaustion. Farmers watch sons leave for mandatory military service, proud and uneasy at the same time. Newspapers glorify armies and empires, turning war into an abstract concept filled with honor and adventure. Few truly grasp what modern weapons will do to human bodies. Fewer still imagine that the next war will last years instead of weeks. By the early 1900s, Europe is louder, faster, and more crowded than ever before. Trains thunder through cities. Factories roar day and night. Telegraph wires hum with constant messages. Everything feels accelerated, as if history itself is rushing forward. Leaders sense that something is coming, but no one agrees on what it will be or how to stop it. Each nation believes it is defending itself, protecting its rightful place in the world. Each one is preparing for the same disaster. Peace survives not because tensions are low, but because fear keeps everyone frozen in place. Fear of losing status. Fear of appearing weak. Fear that hesitation will be fatal. It is a balance maintained not by trust, but by intimidation, like standing on thin ice while convincing yourself it will hold. By the summer of 1914, the system is stretched to its limit. Alliances are set. War plans are finalized. Armies are ready. All that remains is a spark. Somewhere, someone will make a decision that cannot be taken back. And when that moment comes, the entire structure of European peace will collapse in days, dragging the world with it, and proving that the storm was never sudden at all. It had been gathering for decades, waiting for the instant when fear finally gave way to action. Chapter 2. The Spark in Sarajevo. The Assassination that Changed the World. The car rolls slowly through the narrow streets of Sarajevo, its engine idling, tires crunching softly over cobblestones slick with early summer dust. The air is warm, heavy, and restless. Flags hang from windows, some in celebration, some in quiet defiance. Along the sidewalks, faces blur together, curious civilians, wary police, young men standing too still for comfort. No one knows that in a matter of seconds, history will fracture here, on this ordinary street, in this unremarkable city, far from the great capitals of Europe. No one knows that the world is about to step over a line it can never cross back. Sarajevo sits at the edge of empires and identities, a place where cultures overlap and tensions never fully fade. In 1914, it belongs to Austria-Hungary, but its heart does not beat for Vienna. The city is deeply Slavic, deeply Bosnian, deeply shaped by centuries of Ottoman rule and recent imperial occupation. For many here, Austria-Hungary is not a protector, but a presence, imposed, distant, and resented. The annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina a few years earlier had been legal on paper, but on the streets it felt like theft. Beneath the surface, anger simmers quietly, passed from one generation to the next. Across the Balkans, nationalism is no longer just an idea. It is a living force. Serbia, small but fiercely proud, dreams of uniting South Slavic peoples into a single nation. Every border drawn by empires feels artificial. Every imperial official feels like an obstacle to destiny. Young men grow up hearing stories of heroes who resisted foreign rule, absorbing the belief that sacrifice is not only noble, but necessary. In this atmosphere, radicalism does not arrive suddenly. It grows naturally, fed by frustration and hope in equal measure. In Vienna, these tensions are understood, but often dismissed. Austria-Hungary is an old empire, governed by tradition and bureaucracy, confident that authority will endure because it always has. But confidence hides fear. The empire knows it is vulnerable, stretched thin, its internal unity fragile. It watches Serbia with suspicion, convinced that Serbian nationalism threatens to unravel everything. Every protest, every whisper of rebellion, feels like the beginning of collapse. Into this fragile moment steps Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. He is not universally loved, even within his own empire. He is rigid, outspoken, sometimes abrasive. Yet he also believes reform is necessary. He understands that the empire cannot survive unchanged. Ironically, he supports greater autonomy for Slavic peoples within Austria-Hungary, a position that, had it been realized, might have reduced the appeal of Serbian nationalism. But intentions matter little in a world governed by symbols. To nationalists, Franz Ferdinand is not a reformer. He is the face of imperial domination. His visit to Sarajevo on June 28th is poorly timed and deeply provocative. The date carries meaning. It is a Serbian national day, commemorating a medieval battle that symbolizes sacrifice and resistance. For Slavic nationalists, the Archduke's presence feels like an insult layered upon an old wound. Security preparations are made, but they are careless, almost casual. There is a sense that nothing serious will happen, that tensions can be managed, that danger is theoretical rather than real. Meanwhile, a small group of young conspirators prepares quietly. They are not seasoned soldiers or professional revolutionaries. They are students, idealists, shaped by poetry, politics, and anger. Among them is Gavrilo Princip, thin, intense, barely out of his teens. He believes deeply in the idea that history can be changed by individual action. To him, sacrifice is not tragic. It is meaningful. He does not see himself as a murderer, but as an instrument of destiny. Weapons are smuggled across borders. Plans are whispered, revised, doubted, and reaffirmed. There is fear, but it is overshadowed by conviction. Each conspirator knows the odds are against them. They expect failure. They expect death. What they do not expect is how easily events will spiral beyond anyone's control. On the morning of the visit, Sarajevo wakes beneath a cloudless sky. Church bells ring. The river flows quietly beside the road. Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie arrive together, riding in an open-top car. Their presence feels almost informal, disarmingly calm. Sophie smiles at the crowds. Franz Ferdinand sits stiffly, aware but unguarded. The motorcade moves slowly, following a published route that anyone can memorize. As the cars pass along the Appel Quay, the first conspirator hesitates. His nerve fails him. The second does nothing. The third, pressed by fear and urgency, throws a bomb. It bounces off the Archduke's car and explodes beneath the next vehicle, injuring officers and bystanders. Smoke fills the air. Screams echo against the stone buildings. Chaos erupts, but the target survives. Franz Ferdinand is shaken, angry, but alive. The motorcade speeds away. Incredibly, the visit continues. There is a belief that stopping now would signal weakness. A reception is held. Words are exchanged. Tension hangs thick in the room. The Archduke insists on visiting the wounded at the hospital. It is a decision that seems compassionate and proves fatal. A fatal mistake is made. The route is changed, but the driver is not informed. The car turns onto the wrong street, slows, then stops while attempting to reverse. Time seems to hesitate. By sheer coincidence, Gavrilo Princip is standing only a few feet away. He had failed. He believed the moment was lost. And then, suddenly, it is placed directly in front of him. The sounds are sharp, deafening in their finality. 2 shots. One strikes Sophie. One strikes Franz Ferdinand. Blood spreads quickly across white fabric. Sophie collapses. Franz Ferdinand slumps forward, stunned, whispering to his wife not to die. Within minutes, both are gone. The crowd stands frozen. The street falls silent in a way that feels unnatural, as if the city itself understands what has just occurred. The assassin is seized. The car pulls away. The moment passes. And yet, nothing passes at all. Because these deaths are not just personal tragedies. They are symbols, and symbols carry weight far beyond the individuals they represent. News travels rapidly along telegraph wires, faster than thought, faster than reflection. In Vienna, shock hardens into rage. In Berlin, calculations begin almost immediately. In St. Petersburg, sympathy for Serbia blends with fear of Austrian retaliation. In Paris and London, diplomats read reports with growing unease, sensing that something fragile has finally snapped. Austria-Hungary does not see the assassination as an isolated act. It sees it as proof. Proof that Serbia is a threat. Proof that nationalism must be crushed before it spreads further. But acting alone feels risky. The empire looks to its ally, Germany, seeking reassurance. What it receives is more than reassurance. It receives a promise of unconditional support, a blank check that removes hesitation and magnifies confidence. In Serbia, the reaction is complex. There is no official celebration, but there is quiet understanding. The assassins are seen by some as criminals, by others as heroes. The Serbian government denies involvement, and truthfully, it had not ordered the attack. But denial matters little in an environment already poisoned by suspicion. Austria-Hungary is no longer interested in nuance. What follows is not an immediate war, but something more dangerous, a pause. A moment where everyone waits, calculates, and convinces themselves they are acting defensively. Diplomatic language grows sharper. Ultimatums are drafted with demands designed to be rejected. Each government believes it is responding, not provoking. Each step feels justified. Each step narrows the path back to peace. The assassination becomes the spark because the ground is already soaked in fuel. Without decades of rivalry, militarism, and fear, it might have remained a regional crisis. But in 1914, Europe is primed for catastrophe. Alliances transform local anger into international obligation. Mobilization plans turn political decisions into irreversible military movements. What could have been contained now accelerates beyond control. Gavrilo Princip will fade into history, imprisoned, sick, and ultimately dead before the war ends. Franz Ferdinand will be remembered more for his death than his life. But neither man truly controls what happens next. Their moment in Sarajevo becomes the trigger for a system designed to collapse under pressure. As the days pass, telegrams replace gunshots. Decisions are made in palaces and offices, far from the street where blood still stains the stones. And while Europe debates responsibility and response, armies quietly prepare to move. Trains are readied, timetables checked, borders watched. The world has not yet realized it is at war. But the fuse is lit, and it is burning fast, carrying the fire outward, toward every nation bound by promise, pride, and fear. Chapter 3. The Domino Effect. How one crisis became a world war. The streets of Sarajevo grow quiet after the gunshots fade, but across Europe, something begins to move. Not armies yet, not cannons. Words move first. Telegrams tapped out late into the night. Conversations behind closed doors. Men in dark suits pacing polished floors, weighing phrases that will decide the fate of millions. The assassination is over, but its echo is only beginning to spread, bouncing from capital to capital, growing louder with every response. In Vienna, grief curdles quickly into fury. Franz Ferdinand had been complicated, often unpopular, but he was still the heir to the throne, the embodiment of imperial authority. His murder feels personal, humiliating, and dangerous. The empire's leaders do not see the attack as the act of a few young radicals. They see it as a warning shot fired at the heart of Austria-Hungary itself. If Serbia can allow this to happen, then Serbia must be confronted decisively. Yet, Austria-Hungary hesitates, not because it doubts its anger, but because it doubts its strength. The empire is old, slow, internally divided. War against Serbia risks drawing in Russia, protector of the Slavic peoples. That possibility chills Vienna's resolve. Before acting, Austria-Hungary turns to Berlin. In Germany, the reaction is swift and confident. German leaders read the situation through the lens of power and timing. They believe war is coming eventually, with Russia, with France, perhaps with Britain, and that waiting will only make their enemies stronger. Austria-Hungary's crisis feels like an opportunity to strike before the balance shifts further against them. Germany assures Vienna of full support, unconditional and immediate. The message is clear. Act now, and we stand with you. This promise removes restraint. It transforms hesitation into momentum. Across the continent in St. Petersburg, Russia watches events unfold with growing alarm. Russia sees itself as the guardian of Slavic nations, especially Serbia. Backing down would mean losing influence, prestige, and credibility. The Russian leadership fears that if Austria-Hungary crushes Serbia, Russian power in the Balkans will evaporate. At the same time, Russia is not ready for war. Its army is vast but poorly equipped. Railways are incomplete. Officers remember recent humiliations. And yet, doing nothing feels worse than risking everything. France watches from the west, bound to Russia by alliance and shared fear of Germany. French leaders know that if Russia falls, France will stand alone against a powerful and resentful Germany. Memories of defeat decades earlier still sting. Alsace-Lorraine remains lost. The thought of German dominance in Europe is intolerable. Quiet assurances are given. Support will come if Russia stands firm. Britain remains uncertain. For generations, British policy has been to prevent any single power from dominating the continent. Germany's rise has already caused anxiety, especially its rapidly expanding navy. Yet Britain is not bound by treaty to intervene immediately. It hopes diplomacy might still succeed. British leaders believe reason can prevail if the situation is handled carefully. That belief will not last long. Weeks pass, but the atmosphere grows heavier by the day. Newspapers speculate. Stock markets tremble. Rumors spread faster than facts. Beneath the surface, military planners begin quietly reviewing mobilization schedules, knowing that once begun, these plans cannot be easily stopped. Mobilization is like winding a massive clock. Once the gears start turning, they cannot be reversed without breaking the mechanism entirely. Austria-Hungary prepares its response. It is not interested in compromise. An ultimatum is drafted for Serbia, filled with demands so severe they threaten Serbian sovereignty itself. Some officials hope Serbia will refuse, providing justification for war. Others believe acceptance would be even better, allowing Austria-Hungary to assert control without fighting. Either way, confrontation feels inevitable. When the ultimatum is delivered, Serbia has only hours to respond. The terms are harsh, humiliating, deliberately invasive. Serbian leaders read them with disbelief and dread. They know refusal means war. Acceptance means submission. In the end, Serbia accepts nearly every demand, bending as far as it possibly can while preserving a sliver of independence. It hopes reason will be enough. It is not. Austria-Hungary dismisses Serbia's response as insufficient. The decision has already been made. On paper, this is still a regional conflict. In reality, the web of alliances tightens. Russia begins mobilizing its forces, not fully, but enough to signal resolve. In military terms, mobilization is preparation. In political terms, it is a threat. Germany watches Russian movements closely and interprets them as aggression. German leaders feel their worst fears confirmed. They believe delay equals defeat. Speed becomes everything. Germany issues warnings. Russia does not halt mobilization. Germany mobilizes in response. France follows. Each action is justified as defensive, yet each one accelerates the collapse of peace. Diplomacy continues, but it feels hollow, like shouting over the roar of an approaching storm. The logic driving these decisions is brutally simple. Military planners have spent years preparing for war as a sequence of steps that must be executed perfectly and quickly. If one nation mobilizes and another does not, the slower one risks catastrophe. Leaders feel trapped by their own preparations. War plans dictate politics, rather than the other way around. Germany faces a strategic nightmare. Fighting Russia in the east and France in the west simultaneously would stretch its forces to the breaking point. To avoid this, German planners rely on a bold gamble. Strike France first, knock it out quickly, then turn east before Russia can fully mobilize. It is a plan built on precision, speed, and the assumption that everything will go exactly right. To reach France quickly, Germany plans to move through Belgium, a small neutral country guaranteed protection by international agreement. German leaders know this risks bringing Britain into the war, but they calculate that Britain might hesitate, that treaties might bend under pressure, that speed will compensate for outrage. They are wrong. When German troops cross into Belgium, the abstract becomes real. Neutrality is violated. Civilians flee as columns of soldiers march through their towns. The smell of dust, sweat, and fear fills the air. Refugees clog roads. Churches and homes become shelters. What had been a diplomatic crisis now looks unmistakably like a war. In London, hesitation evaporates. Britain cannot allow the destruction of Belgian neutrality without undermining the entire international system it depends upon. More importantly, it cannot allow Germany to dominate the continent unchecked. Britain declares war. The last major restraint snaps. Across Europe, bells ring. Mobilization orders are posted. Men gather at train stations with packs on their backs and uncertainty in their eyes. Some are eager, swept up by patriotic fervor. Others are silent, sensing something irreversible has begun. Families embrace, believing separation will be brief. They have no way of knowing that many of these goodbyes will be final. What is striking is how quickly the transformation occurs. In a matter of days, diplomacy gives way to marching boots. Conversations become commands. Borders harden. The world narrows to lines on maps and schedules on paper. No one truly controls the situation anymore. Each nation feels compelled to act because everyone else is acting. This is the domino effect in its purest form. One assassination leads to one ultimatum. One ultimatum triggers one mobilization. One mobilization forces another. Each decision is small when viewed alone. Together, they create unstoppable momentum. Behind the scenes, some voices still urge caution. Some leaders sense disaster. But they are drowned out by confidence, pride, and fear of appearing weak. War is no longer debated as a choice. It is treated as an inevitability that must be managed rather than avoided. By the end of July, Europe is at war, not because anyone truly wanted it, but because no one believed they could stop it without risking everything. The system built to preserve peace through strength has achieved the opposite. Strength has become fragility. Preparation has become paralysis. As armies begin to move toward borders and war plans are put into motion, the illusion of control vanishes. The next phase will not be decided by diplomats or telegrams, but by bullets, shells, and the lives of millions. And as the first troops march forward, confident in victory and blind to what awaits them, the world steps fully into a conflict unlike anything it has ever known. Chapter 4. The Schlieffen Plan and the Race to Paris. Before the first shots are fired on the Western Front, the war already exists on paper. It lives in maps spread across polished tables, in schedules inked down to the minute, in assumptions made years earlier by men who believed war could be engineered like a machine. In Berlin, officers pore over diagrams showing arrows sweeping confidently across Europe. These arrows promise speed, precision, and victory. They promise that if Germany moves fast enough, the war will be over before it truly begins. What they cannot promise is mercy. The plan guiding Germany's opening move is simple in theory and ruthless in execution. Germany cannot afford to fight both France and Russia at the same time for long. Russia is vast, but slow to mobilize. France is smaller, faster, and closer. The solution, German planners believe, is to strike France first with overwhelming force, knock it out in weeks, then turn east to face Russia before it can fully gather its strength. War, in this vision, is a race against time. The heart of the plan is movement. Germany will not attack France head-on through its heavily fortified border. Instead, it will swing a massive right wing through neutral Belgium, then down into northern France, encircling Paris from the west. The maneuver is bold, almost elegant. It depends on railways running perfectly, troops marching without delay, supplies arriving exactly when needed. It assumes that Belgian resistance will be minimal, that Britain might stay out, and that French forces will collapse under pressure. It assumes that human beings will behave like clockwork. On the other side of the border, Belgium is unprepared for what is coming. It is a small nation, proud of its neutrality, trusting in international law to protect it. Its fortresses are strong, but few believe they will ever be tested. When German demands for passage arrive, Belgian leaders refuse. The decision is made quietly, firmly. To surrender neutrality without resistance would mean losing sovereignty entirely. Belgium chooses honor, even as it senses the cost. German troops cross the border in the early days of August. The invasion is sudden, overwhelming. Columns of infantry march through fields and villages, rifles glinting in the sun. Artillery follows, rumbling like distant thunder. Belgian forts open fire. Bridges are blown. Roads are blocked. Resistance is fierce, unexpected, and costly. German commanders are frustrated. The timetable is already slipping. Civilians watch in horror as war spills into their streets. Homes are abandoned. Smoke rises where shells fall. Rumors spread of atrocities, reprisals, executions. Fear moves faster than armies. Refugees pour westward, carrying what they can, leaving behind lives built over generations. The invasion of Belgium shocks the world. Neutrality has been violated. The rules have been broken. And with that, Britain's hesitation ends. As Britain enters the war, its professional army begins crossing the Channel. They are few compared to the massive continental forces, but they are well-trained and confident. They will soon discover that training does not prepare you for the scale of what is coming. They march into Belgium, believing they are supporting a French advance. Instead, they collide with the full weight of Germany's. France, meanwhile, launches its own offensive. Driven by doctrine, pride, and the desire to reclaim lost territory, French armies surge toward Alsace-Lorraine. Soldiers wear bright uniforms, believing visibility symbolizes courage. They march forward to the sound of bugles and the cheers of civilians. They run headlong into machine guns and modern artillery. The results are devastating. Bodies fall in rows. The fields turn red. Courage proves powerless against firepower. The German advance continues westward, vast and relentless. Villages fall one by one. Roads choke with troops, horses, wagons, and guns. Heat, exhaustion, and confusion mount. Officers struggle to maintain control as units stretch thin. Orders are delayed or misunderstood. The plan demands perfection, but war delivers friction. Every delay, every unexpected resistance, every exhausted soldier adds strain. As the German armies push deeper into France, Paris looms ahead, not just as a city, but as a symbol. The fall of Paris would mean more than military defeat. It would be psychological collapse. French leaders feel the pressure intensely. Government offices prepare to evacuate. Archives are packed. The city braces itself for siege. Parisians listen for distant guns, wondering if the capital will be lost again. And yet, something's going wrong for Germany. The farther the armies march, the more stretched they become. Supply lines lengthen. Horses collapse. Men sleep where they fall. Communications falter. The right wing, meant to swing wide around Paris, begins to drift inward, pulled by exhaustion and the instinct to engage visible enemies. The carefully planned arc tightens, creating gaps and vulnerabilities. French commanders, desperate and under pressure, search for an opportunity. They find it along the Marne River. There, the advancing German armies expose a flank. The moment is fragile, fleeting. To exploit it requires speed, coordination, and faith that exhausted troops can still fight. The decision is made. Everything hinges on this counterattack. French soldiers are rushed to the front by any means available. Trains, trucks, even civilian taxis are pressed into service. The image becomes legend. Parisian taxis carrying soldiers toward battle, engines rattling, drivers silent, knowing they are part of something larger than themselves. It is improvisation born of necessity, humanity intruding into a war planned with cold precision. The battle that follows is chaotic, brutal, and desperate. Along the Marne, men fight in fields, forests, and villages torn apart by shell fire. Artillery pounds relentlessly. The air smells of smoke and earth. Orders are shouted, lost, repeated. Soldiers stumble forward through exhaustion and fear. There is no sweeping maneuver now, no elegant strategy. There is only survival. German commanders realize too late that the plan is unraveling. Their armies are overextended. The inward turn has exposed them. Counterattacks hit hard. Units struggle to respond. Withdrawal becomes unavoidable. The retreat is not a rout, but it is a shock. The advance that was supposed to end the war has been stopped. Paris is saved. The German gamble has failed. In the aftermath, something profound shifts. The dream of a short war evaporates. Both sides begin digging in, literally and psychologically. Trenches appear almost instinctively as soldiers seek shelter from relentless fire. What begins as shallow scrapes becomes an endless network of earthworks stretching across the countryside. The war freezes in place. The Schlieffen plan, so confident on paper, has collided with reality. It underestimated resistance. It overestimated speed. It ignored the unpredictability of human endurance. Most of all, it assumed war could be controlled. Now, control is slipping away from everyone. For the soldiers who survived those opening weeks, the shock is deep. They had marched believing in decisive battles and quick victory. Instead, they find themselves facing a future of mud, wire, and waiting. The sounds of movement give way to the constant thunder of artillery. The landscape itself begins to disappear, churned in a lifeless soil. Politically, the implications are just as severe. Germany has failed to knock France out. Britain is fully committed. Russia continues to mobilize. What was meant to be a swift strike has become a prolonged struggle on multiple fronts. Resources will be strained. Societies will be tested. The war has already escaped the bounds of imagination. Yet even now, leaders cling to hope. They believe breakthroughs are still possible. They believe technology, courage, or one more push can end the stalemate. They do not yet understand that the war has entered a new phase, one defined not by movement, but by endurance. As autumn settles over the Western Front, the guns do not fall silent. The ground hardens, the lines stabilize, and beneath the soil, beneath the shattered trees and broken villages, the world prepares for something far worse than anyone had planned for. Chapter 5. Digging In. The birth of trench warfare. The first trenches are not meant to last. They are scraped hurriedly into the earth with bayonets, mess tins, and bare hands, shallow lines carved by exhausted men who simply want to survive the next burst of shell fire. Soldiers press their bodies into damp soil, hearts pounding, ears ringing, breathing in the sharp scent of torn earth and smoke. At first, these trenches are temporary shelters, nothing more than pauses in a war everyone still believes will soon move again. But days pass, then weeks, and the trenches deepen. Wood is added. Sandbags rise. The ground itself begins to change shape, reshaped by fear and necessity. Without realizing it, both sides are building the future of the war. After the failure of sweeping maneuvers in the opening months, armies on the Western Front find themselves locked in place. Each attempt to advance is met with devastating fire. Machine guns cut down waves of infantry in seconds. Artillery shells explode with concussive force, shredding bodies and pulverizing terrain. To move above ground is to invite death. So soldiers dig. They dig to hide. They dig to live. They dig because standing still in the open is no longer an option. What emerges is not a single trench, but a system. A living, expanding network carved into the landscape. Frontline trenches face the enemy, often no more than a few hundred yards apart. Behind them lie support trenches, then reserve trenches, all connected by narrow communication trenches that twist and turn to prevent blasts from traveling too far. From above, the lines look like scars etched into the earth, stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. From below, they feel like a world unto themselves. The ground becomes the enemy as much as the opposing army. Rain turns trenches into rivers of mud. Walls collapse. Duckboards are laid down to keep men from sinking into the filth, but they rot quickly, slick with slime. Boots are constantly wet. Feet swell, crack, and bleed. A condition known as trench foot spreads, leaving soldiers in agony, sometimes forcing amputations. The smell is constant: damp earth, unwashed bodies, decaying wood, and the sickly sweetness of rot. Life in the trenches settles into a grim routine. Soldiers stand watch at dawn and dusk, the times most likely for attack. They repair parapets, fill sandbags, drain water, and carry supplies under cover of darkness. Sleep comes in fragments, interrupted by shell fire or shouted orders. Rats grow fat, feeding on scraps and corpses alike. They scurry across sleeping men, fearless and relentless. Lice infest clothing, causing constant itching that never truly goes away. The psychological toll is immense. The trenches offer protection, but they also trap men in a narrow, claustrophobic space where danger is omnipresent and often invisible. Artillery shells can fall without warning, collapsing walls and burying soldiers alive. Snipers watch patiently, waiting for a careless movement, a raised head, a glint of metal. Death feels random, arbitrary, impossible to prepare for. Soldiers learn to live minute by minute, hour by hour. Commanders on both sides struggle to adapt. Pre-war doctrine emphasized movement, decisive battles, and bold offensives. Now, the battlefield refuses to move. Every attempt to break through is repelled with staggering losses. Yet the belief persists that one more push, one more barrage, one more sacrifice will finally crack the enemy line. Orders continue to come down, demanding advances that soldiers know will end in slaughter. Obedience becomes an act of survival as much as discipline. The space between opposing trenches is given a name that perfectly captures its nature: no man's land. It is a wasteland of shell craters, shattered trees, tangled barbed wire, and unburied bodies. Crossing it means exposing oneself to machine gun fire and artillery. At night, patrols crawl forward, listening for movement, cutting wire, probing defenses. The darkness amplifies every sound. A cough, a misstep, a whispered word can bring instant death. Barbed wire becomes a defining feature of this new kind of war. Strung in thick coils and dense barriers, it slows attackers, forcing them to bunch together under fire. Men become entangled, screaming for help that cannot come. Engineers work constantly to repair and expand these obstacles, knowing that wire can mean the difference between life and death. The battlefield becomes an engineered killing zone, designed to maximize casualties. Artillery dominates everything. Guns fire day and night, sometimes for weeks without pause. The ground shakes continuously. Ears ring until silence itself feels unnatural. Soldiers begin to measure time, not by clocks, but by bombardments. The shelling flattens landscapes, erases landmarks, and churns soil into a lifeless soup. Villages disappear. Fields become moonscapes. Nature is annihilated, replaced by a scarred terrain where nothing grows. Communication becomes a nightmare. Telephone wires are constantly cut by shell fire. Runners are sent forward, carrying messages through chaos, knowing they may never return. Orders arrive late, or not at all. Confusion spreads. Units lose contact with each other. In this environment, small decisions made by junior officers and ordinary soldiers can have enormous consequences. Initiative matters, but it is punished as often as it is rewarded. Despite the misery, moments of humanity persist. Soldiers share cigarettes, jokes, letters from home. They carve names into trench walls, cling to routines, invent rituals to make the unbearable bearable. Music drifts across the lines at night. In rare, surreal moments, enemies exchange greetings or insults shouted across no man's land. These moments do not stop the war, but they remind those trapped within it that the men on the other side are just as frightened and exhausted. As winter sets in, conditions worsen. Snow falls into trenches already flooded with mud. Frostbite adds to the list of afflictions. Supplies run low. Hot food becomes a memory. Yet the lines hold. Neither side can push the other back, but neither will withdraw. The stalemate hardens into something permanent. What was once improvisation becomes doctrine. High command begins to accept the reality of trench warfare, even as they search desperately for ways to break it. Engineers design deeper dugouts to protect against shelling. New tactics are debated, but for now, endurance is the only strategy that works. Hold the line. Survive the barrage. Wait for orders. The war begins to feel endless. Soldiers realize they are not fighting for ground measured in miles, but for yards measured in blood. Progress is counted in cratered fields and shattered villages. Victory feels abstract, distant, almost meaningless compared to the immediate goal of staying alive until morning. The trenches also reshape how soldiers think about time and fate. The future narrows to the next bombardment, the next patrol, the next dawn's stand to. Long-term hopes fade. Letters from home feel like messages from another world. The war outside the trenches, the speeches, the politics, the strategies, feels unreal compared to the cold, wet reality underfoot. By the end of the first winter, it is clear that something fundamental has changed. The Western Front is no longer a place of movement and maneuver. It is a vast, static battlefield where millions of men are locked in a deadly embrace, unable to advance, unwilling to retreat. The trenches have turned the war into a test of endurance between nations, economies, and entire societies. And yet, even as soldiers settle into this grim existence, leaders on both sides refuse to believe that this is the war's final shape. They search for new weapons, new tactics, new ways to force movement back into a frozen battlefield. Somewhere beyond the trenches, engineers and scientists are already working on ideas that promise to break the stalemate. For the men living underground, none of that matters yet. What matters is the next shell, the next order, the next breath. The trenches are no longer just a response to danger. They are the war itself. And as they deepen and spread, they signal that the conflict has entered a far darker, more relentless phase, one that will demand sacrifices on a scale the world has never endured before. Chapter 6. Hell on Earth. Life and Death in the Trenches. Night settles over the trenches like a suffocating blanket, heavy and damp, pressing down on men who no longer remember what true darkness felt like before the war. There is no silence here. Even in the quiet moments, the front breathes. Distant artillery thumps like a slow, uneven heartbeat. Flares hiss as they climb into the sky, and somewhere nearby a wounded man groans, his voice fading in and out as exhaustion overtakes pain. Sleep comes only in fragments, snatched between barges, always shallow, always alert. In the trenches, rest is never safe. By daylight, the world reveals itself in brutal detail. Mud coats everything: uniforms, weapons, faces, food. It clings to skin like a second layer, cold and unyielding. Men wake soaked, cramped, stiff from hours spent crouched against trench walls that sweat moisture continuously. Fingers are numb. Knees ache. Backs scream in protest. Every movement feels heavier than the last, as if the earth itself is trying to pull them under. The trenches are alive in the worst possible way. Rats scuttle freely, fearless, bloated from feeding on scraps and corpses alike. They gnaw at bread, leather straps, even sleeping men if given the chance. Lice infest clothing, crawling endlessly, leaving skin raw from constant scratching. The itching never stops. It becomes part of existence, an irritation so constant it almost fades into the background, until the moment it drives a man to madness. Death is everywhere, yet never predictable. A soldier can survive weeks of shelling only to be killed by a single sniper's bullet when he lifts his head for a second too long. Another can stand calmly through an artillery barrage and then vanish when a trench wall collapses under a direct hit, burying him alive beneath tons of earth. There is no warning, no pattern, no fairness. Survival feels random, and randomness is terrifying. Artillery dominates life and death in the trenches. Shells scream overhead with a rising howl that freezes the blood, followed by explosions that punch the ground and rattle bones. The shock waves slam into bodies, leaving ears ringing, chests tight, hearts racing. Even when shells miss, The noise alone is overwhelming. Men begin to flinch at every sound, jump at sudden movements, brace themselves instinctively for impacts that never come. Over time, the mind begins to break under the strain. Soldiers struggle to articulate what is happening to them. Hands tremble uncontrollably. Speech falters. Eyes stare blankly, unblinking, fixed on horrors replaying endlessly in memory. This condition becomes known as shell shock, though no one truly understands it yet. Some believe it is cowardice. Others think it is physical damage to the brain. For those who suffer it, the cause matters little. Their nerves are shattered, their inner world reduced to constant fear. The trenches strip away illusions quickly. The idea of glorious combat dissolves into the reality of waiting. Waiting for orders, waiting for bombardments, waiting for death. Time stretches unnaturally. Minutes feel endless. Days blur together. Soldiers stop counting weeks and begin measuring survival in hours. Tomorrow becomes an abstract concept, almost meaningless. Food arrives when it can, often cold, sometimes spoiled. Bread is hard. Meat is greasy. Water tastes of rust and chemicals. Eating becomes mechanical, driven by necessity rather than hunger. Some men lose their appetite entirely. Others eat obsessively, clinging to routine as a lifeline. Supplies are precious, carried forward under fire by men who know they might die delivering something as simple as tea or ammunition. The smell of the trenches is impossible to escape. It is a mixture of wet earth, sweat, decay, cordite, and human waste. Latrines overflow. Bodies cannot always be recovered from no man's land. The scent of death lingers constantly, sweet and sickening. Soldiers learn to recognize it instantly. It seeps into clothing, into hair, into dreams. Fear takes many forms. There is the sharp fear of attack, when whistles blow and men climb ladders into gunfire. There is the slow, grinding fear of bombardment, when shells fall for hours with no way to fight back. And there is the quiet fear that settles during long stretches of waiting, when imagination fills the silence with possibilities far worse than reality. Fear becomes a companion, always present, sometimes loud, sometimes whispering. Yet alongside fear exists something else, an intense bond between men who depend entirely on one another. In the trenches, comradeship is not sentimental. It is survival. Men learn each other's habits, fears, and strengths. They share jokes in the darkest moments, laugh at absurdities that would horrify civilians back home. Humor becomes armor, thin but necessary. Letters from home are treasures. They are read and reread until the paper softens in tears. News of births, harvests, and ordinary life feels unreal, like messages from another universe. Some soldiers write back honestly. Others shield their families from the truth, describing conditions far better than they are. Many struggle to find words at all, knowing no description can truly capture what they're living through. When attacks come, they come suddenly. A whistle blows. Hearts pound. Men check rifles with shaking hands. Ladders are climbed. And then they're over the top, stepping into no man's land where everything wants them dead. Machine guns chatter mercilessly. Artillery pounds the ground. Barbed wire looms ahead, twisted and lethal. Men fall, scream, crawl, disappear. Some make it forward. Many do not. Those who survive attacks return changed. Eyes harden. Voices grow quieter. The memory of charging forward under fire never fades. It replays endlessly, especially at night. Some men stop speaking altogether. Others talk constantly, filling the air with words to keep the silence away. Commanders struggle to understand what their men endure. Orders are issued from dugouts far behind the lines, where danger feels distant. Maps show objectives in clean lines and symbols. On the ground, those symbols are craters filled with bodies. Miscommunication breeds resentment. Soldiers feel expendable. Officers feel trapped between impossible demands and the reality of modern firepower. Weather becomes an enemy that never rests. Rain floods trenches, turning them into sucking pits of mud that steal boots and collapse walls. Cold stiffens fingers until pulling a trigger becomes painful. Heat brings flies, disease, and unbearable stench. Every season delivers its own misery. There is no relief. Occasionally, moments of eerie calm break through the horror. On rare nights, soldiers hear singing from the opposite trench. Familiar melodies drift across no man's land, reminding everyone of shared humanity. For brief moments, the war seems unreal, suspended. Then a flare bursts overhead, machine guns resume their watchful chatter, and reality crashes back in. The constant exposure to death reshapes how soldiers think about life itself. Some grow reckless, convinced fate has already been decided. Others become obsessively cautious, following rituals meant to ward off bad luck. Superstition thrives. Lucky charms are carried. Patterns are searched for in chaos. Anything that offers the illusion of control is embraced. Medical care struggles to keep pace with the scale of suffering. Stretcher bearers risk their lives retrieving the wounded under fire. Field hospitals overflow. Doctors work until exhaustion, performing amputations by the hundreds, often without anesthesia. Infection spreads easily. Survival depends as much on luck as skill. The emotional toll extends beyond fear and exhaustion. Guilt haunts survivors who watch friends die beside them. Helplessness gnaws at those trapped in bombardments, unable to act. Rage simmers at unseen enemies and distant leaders. Grief becomes constant, too frequent to fully process. Mourning is postponed indefinitely. Over time, soldiers begin to understand that the trenches are not temporary. They are not waiting for the war to move again. This is the war. The realization sinks in slowly, heavily. The conflict is not about sweeping victories or heroic charges. It is about endurance, about which side can suffer longer without breaking. The outside world continues, almost oblivious. Newspapers print optimistic headlines. Politicians promise progress. But in the trenches, optimism feels like a cruel joke. Progress is measured in survival, not territory. Hope narrows to small things: a letter, a hot meal, a day without shelling. And still, the guns continue. Day after day, night after night. The trenches grind men down physically and mentally, reshaping entire generations. Those who emerge will never fully leave this place behind. Even if they survive the war, the trenches will follow them home, etched into memory, into nightmares, into silence. As months drag on, commanders and politicians begin to realize the truth the soldiers have lived with all along. This war cannot be won quickly. The trenches have locked the conflict into a brutal stalemate that demands new solutions, new weapons, new ways to break human endurance itself. Somewhere beyond the front lines, minds are already working on ideas that promise to change the battlefield. Innovations that will bring new terror and new hope in equal measure. For the men still crouched in mud and darkness, none of that matters yet. What matters is surviving the next barrage, the next night, the next dawn. The trenches have transformed war into something relentless and inescapable. And as the world begins searching for ways to break this deadlock, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The cost of doing so will be paid in blood on a scale humanity has never seen before. Chapter 7: New Weapons, New Horrors. Technology changes war. The war had already become unbearable, but now it begins to transform into something even more frightening. In workshops, laboratories, and factories far from the trenches, engineers and scientists work relentlessly, searching for ways to break the deadlock. Their solutions are not born from cruelty alone, but from desperation. If the enemy cannot be defeated by courage or numbers, then perhaps they can be crushed by invention. What emerges is a new kind of warfare, one where technology races ahead faster than humanity can understand consequences. The machine gun becomes the most feared presence on the battlefield. It is not new, but in this war it finally finds its true purpose. Positioned behind sandbags, cooled by water, fed by endless belts of ammunition. It fires hundreds of rounds a minute without pause. Against it, waves of infantry stand little chance. Men charge forward bravely, rifles in hand, only to be cut down in seconds. The sound is unforgettable, a mechanical ripping noise that echoes across no man's land, turning open ground into a killing zone. Officers quickly realize that bravery alone cannot overcome a weapon designed to kill efficiently, relentlessly, without fatigue. Artillery grows even deadlier. Guns become larger, shells heavier, ranges longer. Battles are no longer fought face to face, but at distances where enemies never see one another. Entire villages are erased before infantry ever arrives. Shells burst with concussive force, tearing bodies apart and burying men alive. The earth itself becomes unstable, shaking constantly under bombardment. Soldiers begin to fear the unseen more than the visible enemy, knowing death can arrive without warning from miles away. Then comes the gas. At first, it drifts quietly across the battlefield, almost gently, carried by the wind in pale clouds. Some soldiers mistake it for smoke, another inconvenience to endure. Within moments, eyes burn, lungs seize. Men claw at their throats, desperate for air that will not come. Panic spreads faster than the gas itself. Those without protection flee blindly, trampling one another in their terror. Chlorine gas fills the trenches, heavier than air, sinking downward, seeking out the wounded who cannot escape. Gas warfare introduces a new level of horror. It does not kill quickly. It suffocates, blinds, scars. Survivors cough violently, lungs permanently damaged, eyes ruined. The smell lingers, sharp, chemical, unnatural. Masks are issued, but early versions are crude, uncomfortable, and unreliable. Soldiers sleep with them on, knowing a surprise attack at night could mean death within seconds. Fear becomes invisible, drifting silently on the breeze. As one side introduces gas, the other responds in kind. New compounds are developed, each more lethal than the last. Mustard gas burns skin and eyes, leaving blistered bodies writhing in agony. It lingers on the ground for days, contaminating trenches and shell holes, turning the battlefield into a toxic wasteland. Gas attacks do not always kill, but they disable, overwhelm medical systems, and break morale. The battlefield becomes a place where even the air itself is hostile. Above the trenches, the sky is no longer empty. At the start of the war, aircraft are little more than fragile machines, used for observation. Pilots wave at each other as they pass, unarmed, almost sporting. But that innocence vanishes quickly. Guns are mounted. Tactics evolve. The sky becomes another battlefield. Dogfights erupt high above the trenches, planes circling and diving like birds of prey. Engines roar. Bullets tear through canvas wings. Pilots fall in flames or spiral helplessly toward the ground. Airplanes change how war is seen. For the first time, commanders can observe enemy positions from above, spotting troop movements and artillery emplacements. Bombs are dropped on railways, factories, and cities. Civilians look up in terror as death arrives from the sky, an entirely new dimension of vulnerability. The idea that war can reach anywhere begins to sink in. At sea, technology reshapes the conflict just as dramatically. Submarines, once experimental, become weapons of strategic terror. Silent and unseen, they stalk merchant ships across the oceans. Without warning, torpedoes strike. Ships explode. Sailors are thrown into icy waters, often with no chance of rescue. Civilian crews die alongside military targets, blurring the line between combatant and the ocean itself becomes a battlefield, vast and unforgiving. Naval blockades tighten, strangling economies. Supplies grow scarce. Hunger spreads. Civilians far from the front lines begin to feel the war's grip. Technology allows nations to fight not just armies, but entire populations. Total war becomes reality. Back on land, Engineers search for a way to overcome trenches and machine guns. The answer arrives slowly, clumsily, in the form of armored vehicles that crawl across the battlefield on metal tracks. Tanks appear almost monstrous, belching smoke, grinding over wire and craters. At first, they are unreliable, prone to breakdowns and mechanical failure. But when they move, they inspire both terror and hope. Machine gun fire bounces harmlessly off their armor. For the first time in years, infantry can advance behind something that offers protection. The sight of tanks changes the psychology of battle. Enemy soldiers flee or surrender, stunned by a weapon they have never seen before. Commanders begin to imagine breakthroughs again. Though still imperfect, the tank represents a future where mobility might return to the battlefield. It is a glimpse of how war might evolve beyond stalemate, at a terrible cost. Communication technology struggles to keep pace with destruction. Radios are rare and unreliable. Wires are cut constantly by shell fire. Runners continue to risk their lives carrying messages across chaos. Signal flares light the night sky in desperate attempts to coordinate attacks. Miscommunication leads to tragedy. Advances without support, bombardments falling short, friendly fire killing allies. War becomes a massive, grinding machine where small errors cost thousands of lives. Medicine, too, is forced to adapt. Surgeons develop new techniques to treat wounds caused by high explosive shells and shrapnel. Blood transfusions become more common. Triage systems are refined, deciding who can be saved and who must be left to die. The scale of injury is overwhelming. Bodies are torn apart in ways never seen before. Doctors work until collapse, hands stained with blood, haunted by those they cannot help. The psychological impact of these new weapons is profound. Soldiers fear gas more than bullets, artillery more than enemy charges, machine guns more than bayonets. War becomes impersonal. Death comes from machines, not faces. Killing is industrialized, efficient, distant. Many soldiers feel reduced to components in a vast mechanism they cannot control or escape. Propaganda attempts to keep pace with reality. Governments glorify new weapons as symbols of progress and ingenuity. Newspapers celebrate aces in the sky and victories at sea. The grim truth of technological warfare is softened, hidden, or ignored. At the front, soldiers know better. They live inside the consequences of invention, watching friends die to devices designed far from the battlefield. Each innovation sparks a countermeasure. Gas masks improve. Armor thickens. Tactics evolve. War becomes an arms race, not just between nations, but between offense and defense, invention and adaptation. The pace is relentless. There is no pause to reflect, no time to ask whether something should be built, only whether it can be built faster than the enemy. Civilians feel the effects as factories roar day and night, churning out shells, guns, aircraft, and tanks. Entire economies reorganize around production. Women enter industrial workforces in unprecedented numbers. Cities glow with furnaces and assembly lines. The war reshapes society as deeply as it reshapes the battlefield. Yet for all this technological power, the fundamental problem remains. Breakthroughs are rare. Casualties remain staggering. Machines kill efficiently, but they do not end the war. Each new weapon promises salvation, but delivers only escalation. The battlefield grows deadlier, not decisive. Soldiers begin to realize that survival depends not just on courage, but on adaptation. Learning when to move, when to hide, how to read the sound of shells, how to recognize gas before it kills. War becomes a test of awareness as much as endurance. Those who cannot adapt are quickly removed from the battlefield, often permanently. As months pass, the realization sets in that humanity has crossed a threshold. Warfare is no longer constrained by tradition or honor. It is limited only by imagination and resources. The tools being unleashed will not disappear when the war ends. They will shape future conflicts, future fears, future worlds. The men crouched in trenches feel this shift intuitively. They know they are living through a transformation, even if they cannot fully name it. They sense that the war has become something beyond their control, something larger than any single nation or cause, a machine that feeds on innovation and suffering alike. And still, leaders believe that one final improvement, one decisive technological advantage, will tip the balance. Somewhere, new plans are forming. New weapons are being tested. The search for a way out of stalemate continues. But for now, the battlefield belongs to machines, and to the men caught between them, struggling to remain human in a war that seems determined to strip that humanity away. Chapter 8, 1915. The war expands, and the stalemate deepens. The year turns, but nothing truly changes. The guns do not stop. The trenches do not move. Winter loosens its grip only to reveal landscapes ruined beyond recognition, fields churned into mud, villages flattened into memory. Soldiers emerge from frozen months blinking into weak spring light, hoping that warmer weather might bring movement, might bring an end. Instead, 1915 delivers something far worse. The war does not break open. It spreads. On the Western Front, commanders refuse to accept stalemate as permanent. Every staff meeting ends with the same conclusion. The enemy line must be broken, no matter the cost. Artillery is massed. Barrages are planned to last days, even weeks, under the belief that nothing living can survive such punishment. Maps are marked with arrows and objectives. Orders are written with confidence that this time, the breakthrough will come. When the guns finally fall silent, infantry climb out of trenches into no man's land once more. They move forward cautiously at first, then faster, boots sinking into mud and shell holes. Smoke hangs thick in the air. Visibility is poor. Men stumble over shattered wire, and bodies half buried in the earth. And then the machine guns open fire. The bombardment has not destroyed the enemy defenses. It has worn them. Waves of soldiers are cut down almost immediately. Survivors dive for cover that does not exist. The ground absorbs blood and screams with equal indifference. These failed offensives repeat again and again. Names change. Locations change. The result remains the same. Yard by yard, nothing is gained except graves. Commanders blame timing, coordination, weather, anything but the fundamental reality that frontal assaults against fortified positions are suicide. And yet, without alternatives, they continue. As losses mount, desperation grows. New tactics are discussed, but the war machine moves faster than innovation. The pressure to show progress is relentless. Political leaders demand results. Newspapers promise victory just over the horizon. Soldiers feel the disconnect acutely. They live the truth while the world consumes illusions. In April, something new drifts across the battlefield near Ypres. At first, it looks like fog rolling low over the ground. It moves slowly, deliberately, creeping into Allied trenches. Then men begin to choke. Eyes burn. Lungs seize. Panic erupts. This is chlorine gas, unleashed on a large scale for the first time. Those without protection flee blindly. Those who cannot escape collapse, clawing at their throats. Gas changes the war instantly. It adds a new dimension of fear, one that cannot be seen or fought. Masks are rushed to the front, crude and uncomfortable. Soldiers sleep with them close at hand, knowing a silent cloud could arrive at any moment. Gas attacks become psychological weapons as much as physical ones, eroding morale, creating constant anxiety. Even when gas is not present, the fear of it lingers. The introduction of gas does not break the stalemate. It deepens it. Each new weapon prompts a response, not resolution. The battlefield grows more hostile, more complex, more lethal. Beyond the Western Front, the war stretches outward. In the East, vast distances and weaker infrastructure create a different kind of conflict. Armies maneuver more freely, but at terrible cost. Villages burn. Civilians flee in endless columns. Disease spreads rapidly. The Russian army struggles with shortages of rifles, ammunition, and leadership. Soldiers are sent into battle unprepared, sometimes ordered to pick up weapons from fallen comrades. Morale crumbles under the strain. Germany and Austria-Hungary press their advantage, launching offensives that push Russian forces back hundreds of miles. Entire regions are abandoned. Railways clog with refugees. The front shifts constantly, but movement does not bring relief. Instead, it spreads suffering across an even wider landscape. To the south, another front opens in a gamble born of frustration. Allied leaders believe the Ottoman Empire is weak, a crumbling power that can be knocked out of the war with a decisive blow. The plan is bold: force a passage through narrow straits, seize control of vital waterways, and open a direct route to Russia. If successful, it could change the course of the war. The reality is far harsher. At Gallipoli, Allied troops land on steep, rugged shores under relentless fire. The terrain favors the defenders completely. Soldiers scramble up cliffs, weighed down by equipment, slipping on loose rock and sand. Machine guns rake the beaches. Bodies fall into the surf. The water turns red. What was meant to be a swift strike becomes a nightmare of stalemate and slaughter in miniature. For months, fighting grinds on in heat and dust. Supplies are scarce. Disease spreads rapidly. Flies swarm over everything. The smell of death is constant. Courage is abundant. Success is not. Eventually, the campaign is abandoned. The evacuation, though skillfully executed, cannot erase the cost. Gallipoli becomes a symbol of overconfidence and miscalculation, a reminder that the war punishes even the boldest plans. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the conflict reshapes entire regions. Ottoman forces clash with British-led troops across deserts and ancient cities. Camels replace horses. Sand replaces mud. Yet the suffering remains the same. Battles are fought for railways, canals, and oil fields, resources that will shape the future long after the guns fall silent. In Africa, colonial troops fight in campaigns far removed from European attention. Men from distant lands are drawn into a war they barely understand, fighting for empires that do not consider them equals. The war becomes truly global, stretching supply lines and draining resources. Back home, societies begin to feel the strain. Factories operate around the clock. Women take on industrial roles in unprecedented numbers. Rationing becomes common. Letters from the front carry stories of horror that censors struggle to suppress. Casualty lists grow longer, more familiar. Grief becomes a shared experience. The belief in a short war has fully collapsed. Governments begin to reorganize entire economies around prolonged conflict. This is no longer a clash of armies alone. It is a struggle between nations, systems, and populations. The phrase, total war, becomes reality. At the front, soldiers sense the shift instinctively. They realize they are no longer participants in a campaign that will end soon. They are trapped in a war that may consume years of their lives, if it does not consume their lives entirely. Hope becomes smaller, more fragile. Survival becomes the primary ambition. As 1915 drags on, the stalemate hardens. Trenches deepen. Weapons improve. Casualties climb. No side achieves the breakthrough it desperately seeks. Each failure feeds the next attempt, driven by the belief that endurance alone will eventually force victory. But beneath that belief lies a growing unease. The war is expanding faster than anyone anticipated. New fronts open. New enemies are drawn in. The cost is rising beyond imagination. And still, no clear path to victory appears. By the end of the year, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The war has escaped the control of those who started it. What began as a crisis has become a grinding global conflict with no easy end in sight. And as the world braces itself for another year of fighting, it becomes clear that the worst chapters may still lie ahead. Chapter 9. The Eastern Front. War of Movement and Collapse. The war in the East feels different almost immediately. Here, the horizon stretches farther, the distances are immense, and the front is never quite still. Where the West sinks into trenches and paralysis, the East lurches forward and backward in violent waves. Armies move, retreat, regroup, and collide again across forests, plains, and frozen rivers. It is a war of motion, but not of mercy. If anything, the scale of suffering is even greater, spread across entire regions rather than concentrated in narrow lines. Russia enters the war with confidence born of size rather than preparation. Its army is vast, millions of men drawn from cities and villages scattered across an empire that spans continents. The belief in St. Petersburg is simple: numbers will overwhelm the enemy. But size hides weakness. Railways are incomplete. Supplies are inconsistent. Command structures are rigid and slow. Many soldiers are poorly trained, poorly equipped, and sent forward with little understanding of why they are fighting. In the opening weeks, Russian forces surge into East Prussia, hoping to relieve pressure on France by forcing Germany to divert troops eastward. The advance is chaotic but determined. Columns march through forests and farmland, boots sinking into soft earth, packs heavy with supplies that will soon run out. Communication between units is poor. Orders are sent unencrypted, assuming speed matters more than secrecy. That assumption will prove fatal. Germany responds with speed and precision. Though outnumbered, German commanders exploit their advantage in coordination, rail transport, and intelligence. They intercept Russian communications, reading plans almost as quickly as they are issued. What follows is one of the most decisive encirclements of the war. At Tannenberg, Russian armies stumble into a trap. German forces strike from multiple directions, tightening the noose. The battle is catastrophic for Russia. Entire units are surrounded. Soldiers fight desperately, then surrender by the tens of thousands. Others flee into forests and swamps, hunted down or left to starve. The scale of the defeat is staggering. It is not just a military loss. It is a psychological shock that reverberates through the Russian army and society. Confidence cracks. Doubt spreads. Yet the war does not stop. Russia absorbs the blow and continues. The front shifts southward, where Austria-Hungary faces enormous pressure. Unlike Germany, Austria-Hungary is deeply vulnerable. Its army is divided by language, loyalty, and morale. Soldiers from different ethnic groups struggle to communicate. Officers doubt their men. Men doubt their officers. When Russian forces attack, the empire's weaknesses are exposed mercilessly. Battles rage across Galicia and the Carpathians. Villages change hands repeatedly. Civilians are caught between advancing armies, accused of collaboration by both sides. Homes are burned. Fields are destroyed. Refugees flee in endless columns, carrying children, livestock, and whatever possessions they can save. Hunger follows them like a shadow. The eastern battlefield becomes a place where armies do not just clash, they dissolve. Units break apart. Lines collapse. Retreats turn to panics. Commanders struggle to impose order over distances that stretch communication beyond its limits. When things go wrong, they go wrong on a massive scale. Winter brings no relief. Temperatures plunge. Snow blankets the land. Soldiers march with frostbitten feet, fingers numb, breath freezing in their lungs. Supplies fail to arrive. Rifles jam. Horses collapse. Men huddle together for warmth, sharing what little food remains. Disease spreads rapidly. Typhus and dysentery claim as many lives as bullets. Despite these hardships, the Eastern Front remains fluid. Advances and retreats continue into 1915. Germany and Austria-Hungary launch a massive offensive, pushing Russian forces back hundreds of miles. Entire regions are abandoned. Railways are destroyed during retreat. Factories are dismantled and moved east. The Russian army gives ground to survive, but the cost is immense. For Russian soldiers, morale erodes steadily. Many fight bravely, but they feel expendable. Stories circulate of men sent into battle without rifles, ordered to pick up weapons from fallen comrades. Ammunition runs short. Artillery support is inconsistent. Orders are often contradictory or impossible to carry out. Trust in leadership collapses. At the highest levels, the Russian command struggles with indecision and rivalry. Political interference complicates military planning. The Tsar himself eventually takes personal command, believing his presence will inspire loyalty and discipline. Instead, it ties the fate of the monarchy directly to the fate of the army. Every defeat becomes a blow not just to military confidence, but to the legitimacy of the state itself. In contrast, German forces grow increasingly confident. Victories in the East reinforce belief in their professionalism and efficiency. But even here, success comes at a cost. Long supply lines strain resources. Casualties mount. The war consumes men and material at an unsustainable pace. And while victories bring territory, they do not bring peace. Austria-Hungary's situation grows increasingly desperate. Repeated defeats sap morale. Ethnic divisions deepen. Desertion becomes more common. Soldiers question why they are fighting and for whom. The empire's internal cohesion begins to unravel under the weight of war. The Eastern Front also exposes civilians to unprecedented violence. Entire populations are uprooted. Jews, suspected of disloyalty, are expelled en masse. Pogroms erupt. Ethnic tensions are inflamed and exploited. The war becomes a force that tears apart the social fabric, leaving bitterness and trauma that will last for generations. As months pass, the Russian home front begins to feel the strain. Factories struggle to meet demands. Transportation networks buckle. Food shortages grow worse. Inflation rises. Workers strike. Peasants grumble. The war that was supposed to unite the nation now exposes every weakness in the system. Soldiers at the front sense this decay instinctively. Letters from home speak of hunger and hardship. Pay arrives late or not at all. Confidence in victory fades. Faith in leadership erodes. Some units fight on stubbornly. Others simply stop believing. Yet even as the Russian army falters, it refuses to collapse entirely. Sheer size and endurance keep it in the war longer than expected. German planners had hoped to knock Russia out quickly. Instead, the Eastern Front becomes a grinding drain on resources and attention. Victory remains elusive. The contrast between East and West becomes stark. In the West, the war is static, contained, engineered. In the East, it is chaotic, expansive, and deeply destabilizing. The front moves, but with each movement it spreads destruction over new ground. Entire societies are dragged into the conflict and shattered. By late 1915, the Russian army has suffered catastrophic losses. Millions are dead, wounded, or captured. Confidence in the state wavers. Whispers of unrest grow louder. The bond between soldier and ruler begins to fracture. What started as military strain is becoming political crisis. The war in the East is no longer just about territory or alliances. It is about survival, of armies, of empires, of systems already weakened by inequality and neglect. The pressure is relentless, unyielding. As winter approaches again, the Eastern Front pauses briefly, not out of strategy, but exhaustion. Men dig in where they stand. Supplies are gathered where they can be found. Both sides brace for what comes next. Because beneath the surface of military movements, something far more dangerous is building. The war is not just breaking armies in the East. It is breaking a society. And soon, the cracks spreading through Russia will widen into something far more explosive. A collapse that will change the course of the war and the world forever. Chapter 10. Gallipoli and the War Beyond Europe. The sea is calm as the first boats drift toward the shoreline, oars dipping quietly into dark water. Men crouched low beneath the weight of rifles, packs, and fear. Ahead, jagged cliffs rise sharply from the coast, silent and unmoving. For a moment, it almost feels peaceful. Then the first shots crack through the air, sharp and unmistakable, and the illusion shatters. The war has followed them here, to the edge of Europe, and it will not loosen its grip. By early 1915, frustration dominates Allied thinking. The Western Front is locked in stalemate. The Eastern Front bleeds endlessly, and no decisive breakthrough seems possible. Leaders begin to look elsewhere for solutions, convinced that victory might be found not by pushing harder against hardened lines, but by striking where the enemy is weakest. Their attention turns south, toward the Ottoman Empire, long described as the sick man of Europe, an empire believed to be crumbling under its own weight. The logic seems sound. If the Allies can knock the Ottomans out of the war, they can open a sea route to Russia, ease pressure on the Eastern Front, and potentially force a collapse of the Central Powers from the periphery. Control of the narrow waterways leading from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea will be a strategic prize beyond measure. The plan promises speed, surprise, and decisive impact, everything the Western Front has failed to deliver. But planning from afar rarely survives first contact with reality. The Gallipoli Peninsula is a place of unforgiving terrain. Steep ridges, narrow beaches, dense scrub, and limited fresh water dominate the landscape. It favors the defender completely. Ottoman forces, though often underestimated, are disciplined, determined, and fighting for their homeland. They know the ground intimately. They dig in on the high ground, overlooking every possible landing point. When Allied naval forces attempt to force the straits, they encounter mines hidden beneath the water, artillery positioned carefully along the shores, and defenders who refuse to break. Battleships are damaged or sunk. Confidence falters. The naval assault alone will not be enough. The decision is made to land troops. On the morning of the landings, chaos reigns almost immediately. Boats drift off course. Units land in the wrong places. Some beaches are lightly defended. Others are killing grounds. As soldiers leap into the water, bullets tear through ranks. Men fall before they can even reach shore. Equipment sinks beneath the waves. The surf fills with bodies, rifles, and blood. Those who survive the landing scramble upward, clawing at dirt and rock, gasping for breath under heavy fire. The heat is oppressive. The sun beats down mercilessly. There is little cover, nowhere to hide. Ottoman defenders fire from above, calm and methodical. Each step forward costs lives. For weeks, the fighting settles into a brutal stalemate that mirrors the Western Front, but with new miseries layered on top. Trenches are carved into rocky ground where digging is agonizingly slow. Water is scarce. Food is inadequate. Disease spreads rapidly. Flies swarm over everything, feeding on open wounds and unburied dead. Dysentery weakens entire units. The smell of decay hangs constantly in the air. Soldiers from across the British Empire fight side by side. British, Australian, New Zealander, Indian, and others drawn into a war far from home. Many have never seen combat before. They face it now in its most unforgiving form. Courage is everywhere. So is confusion. Orders are unclear. Coordination falters. Opportunities are missed. Ottoman forces, under capable leadership, hold their ground with relentless determination. They counterattack fiercely, sometimes charging uphill in a gunfire, sometimes striking at night, silent and sudden. Both sides suffer terribly. Gains are measured in yards. Losses are counted in thousands. As the months drag on, it becomes clear that Gallipoli will not deliver the quick victory its planners imagined. Reinforcements arrive. New offensives are launched. Each one ends the same way, with heavy casualties and little progress. Morale begins to crack. Soldiers realize they are trapped in yet another deadlock, one far from the world's attention. Eventually, the unthinkable decision is made. The campaign must be abandoned. Evacuation becomes the only option. In a bitter irony, the withdrawal is one of the most successful operations of the entire campaign. Troops slip away under cover of darkness, quietly, efficiently, leaving behind empty trenches and deception devices that fire rifles automatically to mask their departure. Not a single life is lost during the evacuation. But success in retreat cannot erase the disaster that preceded it. Gallipoli has cost tens of thousands of lives. It has failed to achieve its strategic goals. It has exposed the dangers of arrogance and underestimation. For the Ottoman Empire, It becomes a defining moment of resistance and pride. For the Allies, it becomes a symbol of miscalculation and loss. Yet Gallipoli is only part of a much larger transformation. The war is no longer confined to Europe's heartlands. It is spreading across the globe, reshaping regions that will never return to their old order. In the deserts of the Middle East, fighting takes on a different character. Heat replaces cold. Sand replaces mud. Armies march across vast, open spaces where supply lines are fragile and water is life itself. Control of canals, railways, and oil fields becomes critical. Ancient cities become battlegrounds. The war begins to redraw the map of the region even before it ends. In Mesopotamia, British-led forces push inland, underestimating the challenges ahead. Long supply lines stretch thin. Rivers flood unpredictably. Ottoman resistance stiffens. What begins as an advance turns into siege and surrender. Thousands of soldiers are captured, their fate grim, their suffering prolonged. In the Sinai and Palestine, fighting ebbs and flows, shaped by logistics as much as tactics. Camels replace horses. Columns move slowly across endless landscapes. Yet the war's industrial nature follows them even here. Artillery pounds desert hills. Trenches scar ancient ground. Modern war invades timeless places. Africa, too, becomes a battlefield. Colonial possessions turn into contested zones. Campaigns unfold across jungles, savannas, and mountains. Troops suffer more from disease and exhaustion than combat. Local populations are conscripted, displaced, or forced into labor. The war reaches places barely connected to the decisions that started it, spreading hardship far beyond Europe's borders. At sea, the conflict intensifies. Naval blockades tighten. Merchant shipping becomes a target. Supplies are cut off. Civilian populations begin to feel hunger and deprivation. The war's reach extends into kitchens and factories, into daily life itself. Back in Europe, the consequences of Gallipoli ripple outward. Leaders are shaken, though not always humbled. Some see the failure as proof that bolder action is needed elsewhere. Others retreat into caution. Political careers are made and broken. Trust erodes. For soldiers who fought there, Gallipoli becomes something deeply personal. Survivors carry memories of beaches stained with blood, of relentless heat and flies, of comrades lost in places few had ever heard of before the war. For Australians and New Zealanders in particular, the campaign becomes foundational to national identity, a story of sacrifice that shapes how they see themselves and their place in the world. The broader lesson of Gallipoli is harsh and unmistakable. This war cannot be sidestepped. There is no weak link that can be snapped easily. Every front becomes its own nightmare, demanding lives without offering resolution. The idea that victory can be found on the margins begins to fade. By the end of 1915, the war has fully revealed its global nature. Empires fight not just with armies, but with resources, colonies, and populations spread across continents. Decisions made in London, Berlin, and Paris echo in deserts, jungles, and distant seas. No place is truly untouched. And yet, despite the failures and the mounting costs, the war continues. Leaders refuse to concede. New plans are drawn. New offensives are promised. The belief persists that one decisive effort, one perfect moment, will finally break the deadlock. As another year approaches, the conflict shows no sign of burning itself out. Instead, it grows larger, deeper, more entangled with the fate of entire regions and peoples. The war that began in Europe has become a world war in every sense of the word, and its most devastating chapters are still to come. Chapter 11, Verdun, the longest and most brutal battle. The shells begin falling before dawn, not in scattered bursts, but in an unbroken roar that seems to tear the sky apart. The earth convulses. Trees vanish in clouds of splinters and smoke. Stone fortifications shudder as if alive, their walls cracking under the relentless hammering. Men press themselves against damp concrete and churned soil, mouths open, ears ringing, waiting for something, anything to make it stop. It does not stop. It only grows louder. Verdun has begun. Verdun is not chosen by accident. It is a name carved deep into French memory, a place layered with centuries of defense and symbolism. Forts ring the region like old guardians, reminders of past invasions repelled at terrible cost. To the French, Verdun is not just ground. It is identity. It is proof that the nation endures. German planners understand this intimately. Their objective is not merely territory. It is something far more calculated, far more ruthless. The strategy is chilling in its simplicity. The goal is not to break through the French line quickly. The goal is to bleed France dry. German commanders believe that if they attack a place the French cannot afford to lose, the French will pour men into its defense endlessly. Artillery will do the rest. Every French soldier sent to Verdun will be another life drained away, another step closer to collapse. Victory will come not through movement, but through exhaustion. On the French side, confusion reigns in the opening days. Some forts have been stripped of guns earlier, deemed unnecessary relics of an older war. Now they are needed more than ever. Reinforcements are rushed forward along a single vital road that becomes known as the lifeline of Verdun. Day and night, trucks grind along its length, engines straining, drivers barely sleeping. Men arrive exhausted before they even reach the front. Supplies flow one way. Wounded and dead flow back the other. The battlefield transforms almost immediately. Hills are flattened. Forests are reduced to blackened stumps. The ground becomes a sea of craters filled with mud, blood, and fragments of men. Landmarks disappear so completely that soldiers navigate by memory and instinct alone. The very shape of the earth changes daily under bombardment, so intense it feels endless. Artillery dominates everything. Guns fire in such volume that the air itself seems to vibrate continuously. Soldiers learn to distinguish shells by sound, the whistle of incoming fire, the heavy thud of distant impacts, the sudden, shattering crash of explosions too close to escape. The barrage does not pause to allow rescue or rest. It is meant to crush nerves as thoroughly as bodies. Infantry attacks follow the shelling, but they feel almost secondary. Men advance cautiously through smoke and debris, stepping over bodies and shattered equipment. Machine guns fire from hidden positions. Grenades explode in confined spaces. Combat becomes intimate and savage, fought at close range in shell holes and collapsed trenches. The line shifts forward and back, often measured in meters rather than miles. For the soldiers, Verdun becomes a nightmare without boundaries. There is no safe place. Dugouts collapse. Shelters fail. Even the strongest fortifications crack under sustained bombardment. Men are buried alive, suffocating slowly beneath tons of earth. Others survive near misses only to be driven mad by the concussion. The term shell shock barely captures the reality. Minds fracture under constant terror. French commanders struggle to contain panic. Units rotate in and out of the line constantly, a deliberate attempt to spread the burden of Verdun across the entire army. Nearly every French soldier will pass through this place at some point. Verdun becomes a shared trauma, binding the army together through suffering and endurance. The phrase, "they shall not pass," begins to circulate, not as propaganda alone, but as a desperate affirmation. Holding Verdun becomes a matter of national survival. Retreat is unthinkable. The cost no longer matters in the abstract. What matters is not losing. German forces, meanwhile, find their own expectations shattered. The French do not collapse. They do not break. They endure. German losses mount as well. The artillery that was meant to spare German infantry still takes its toll. Attacks bog down. Gains are hard-won and often lost again. The plan to bleed the enemy becomes mutual slaughter. Weather adds its own cruelty. Rain turns the battlefield into a quagmire. Shell holes fill with water, trapping wounded men who drown slowly, unable to climb out. Heat brings flies and disease. The stench of death becomes overwhelming, a thick, sickly odor that clings to everything. Masks and scarves do little to block it out. Medical stations overflow. Stretchers line the roads. Surgeons work until their hands shake, performing amputations by the hundreds. There is never enough time, never enough supplies. Decisions are made quickly, brutally. Who can be saved? Who cannot? Many die waiting. Communication is chaos. Wires are cut almost as soon as they are laid. Messengers run through fire, knowing the odds. Orders arrive late or not at all. Confusion reigns. Units fight on instinct and stubbornness as much as command. The battle takes on a life of its own, indifferent to planning. As months drag on, Verdun consumes everything. Men stop asking when it will end. They ask only how long they can hold on. Sleep becomes impossible. The constant noise erodes sanity. Some soldiers begin to feel detached from reality, as if watching themselves from outside their own bodies. Others cling fiercely to routine, cleaning rifles obsessively, counting steps, repeating small rituals to ward off fear. German soldiers suffer just as deeply. Their confidence erodes as they realize Verdun will not deliver quick victory. The attritional strategy cuts both ways. Casualties mount relentlessly. Morale wavers. The idea that technology and planning can control war feels increasingly hollow. Verdun becomes a place where time loses meaning. Days blur together. Seasons pass almost unnoticed beneath the thunder of guns. The battle rages on through spring, summer, and into autumn. Each side commits more men, more shells, more resolve. The logic of stopping becomes impossible. Too much has already been sacrificed. Politically, Verdun looms large. French leaders know the nation is watching. Any hint of weakness could shatter confidence at home. German leaders feel trapped by their own strategy. To stop now would mean admitting failure after so much bloodshed. Pride and fear lock both sides in place. By late 1916, the intensity finally begins to ease, not because the objectives have been achieved, but because both armies are exhausted beyond measure. The ground is almost unrecognizable. Verdun has been reduced to a wasteland, a monument to destruction. The final tally defies comprehension. Hundreds of thousands of men killed, wounded, or missing, for what amounts to a few miles of shattered terrain. No decisive breakthrough, no strategic transformation, only loss. And yet, Verdun leaves an indelible mark. For France, it becomes a symbol of endurance, of sacrifice, of national survival at unimaginable cost. For Germany, it stands as a grim lesson in the limits of attrition. For the soldiers who lived through it, Verdun is something far more personal, a place that never truly leaves them. The battle proves that this war cannot be won simply by killing more of the enemy. It exposes the futility of attrition as a path to victory, even as leaders continue to rely on it. Verdun is not an exception. It is a warning. As the guns finally begin to quiet, the world does not breathe easier. Instead, it braces itself, because even as Verdun grinds to a halt, plans are already forming for new offensives elsewhere, driven by the same belief that one more massive effort will finally tip the balance. The lesson of Verdun is written in blood across the landscape. Whether anyone will truly learn it remains uncertain. And as another great battle begins to take shape to the west, the men who survived Verdun know, deep down, that the war's appetite has not yet been satisfied. Chapter 12. The Somme. Sacrifice on an unimaginable scale. The morning breaks clear and calm, almost beautiful in its stillness. Birds lift from hedgerows. Dew clings to the grass. Along miles of trenches, men stand shoulder to shoulder, adjusting packs, checking rifles, forcing calm breaths into tight chests. Watches are checked. Final words are spoken, some whispered, some never said at all. Then the whistles blow, sharp and piercing, and tens of thousands of men climb out of the trenches together, stepping forward into a future none of them truly understands. It is the first day of the Somme. For months before this moment, the earth itself has been punished in preparation. Artillery has fired relentlessly, day and night, hammering German positions with millions of shells. The belief is absolute. Nothing can survive such destruction. Barbed wire will be shredded. Trenches will be crushed. Defenders will be dead, buried, or driven mad. When the infantry advances, resistance will be minimal. The breakthrough everyone has waited for will finally arrive. This belief is comforting. It is also wrong. The Somme is conceived as a joint effort, an enormous Allied offensive designed to relieve pressure on France after the agony of Verdun and to finally shatter the German line. The scale is unprecedented. Entire divisions are assembled, many filled with volunteers who answer the call together, train together, and now march together toward the same fate. In towns and villages across Britain, entire communities have sent their sons to the same units. What happens here will echo far beyond the battlefield. As the whistles fade and the men advance, the illusion collapses almost instantly. The artillery has not destroyed the German defenses. It has churned the ground into mud, buried wire rather than cutting it, and warned the defenders exactly when and where the attack will come. German soldiers emerge from deep dugouts, shaken but alive, machine guns already positioned. The sound that follows is not a roar, but a tearing, mechanical thunder. Machine guns open fire across no man's land, sweeping back and forth with brutal efficiency. Men fall in rows. Some are hit before they take their second step. Others stumble forward, wounded, only to be struck again. The ground becomes slick with blood almost immediately. Officers wave pistols and shout orders that cannot be heard. There is nowhere to hide. Despite the carnage, some units keep moving. Training and discipline carry them forward, even as bodies pile around them. Courage is everywhere. Survival is not. The weight of equipment slows progress. Mud grips boots. Barbed wire looms ahead, tangled and intact. Men bunch together as they struggle to cut through it, becoming perfect targets. Shells burst among them, tearing bodies apart in seconds. By midday, it is clear that the offensive has failed catastrophically in many sectors. Yet the attacks continue. Communications have broken down. Orders cannot be recalled. Men advance because that is what they were told to do. In some areas, small gains are made at enormous cost. In most, nothing is achieved at all. When night finally falls, the battlefield is unrecognizable. The wounded cry out from shell holes, some too injured to move, others trapped in mud that slowly pulls them under. Stretcher bearers venture out under fire, guided by sound and instinct, knowing that every step could be their last. Many wounded will not survive the night. The casualty figures from the first day are staggering beyond comprehension. Tens of thousands are dead or wounded. It is the bloodiest day in British military history. And yet, the offensive does not stop. The Somme is not a single battle. It is a campaign, one that will grind on for months. As days turn into weeks, the fighting becomes a relentless cycle of bombardment and attack. The landscape dissolves into a churned wasteland of craters, shattered trees, and pulverized villages. Landmarks disappear entirely. Men navigate by compass and memory alone. Rain turns the battlefield into a swamp where movement is agony and evacuation nearly impossible. New tactics are introduced in desperate attempts to gain ground. Artillery barges creep forward, timed to advance just ahead of the infantry, meant to suppress defenders long enough for attackers to close in. Timing must be perfect. When it is not, men walk into their own shell fire or face untouched enemy positions. Even when it works, gains are minimal. Tanks appear on the battlefield for the first time in this conflict, strange metal beasts grinding forward amid smoke and confusion. They inspire awe and fear in equal measure. Some break down almost immediately. Others manage to crush wire and silence machine guns briefly, offering a glimpse of a different future. But there are too few of them. They are not yet reliable. The Somme remains a battle of men against machines, and the machines are winning. The psychological toll deepens with every failed assault. Soldiers begin to sense the futility, even as they continue to obey orders. They learn to read the ground, to sense danger instinctively, to accept loss as inevitable. Death becomes ordinary. Grief is postponed, compressed, buried beneath the need to keep functioning. Commanders struggle with the reality they have created. Some cling to optimism, pointing to incremental gains as evidence of progress. Others quietly despair, but see no alternative. Political pressure to continue is immense. The Somme has become too large to stop. Too many lives have already been spent to admit failure. On the German side, the experience is no less harrowing. Defenders endure relentless bombardment that pulverizes positions and nerves alike. Dugouts collapse. Men are buried alive. Reserves are rushed forward to plug gaps, fighting in conditions just as horrific as those faced by attackers. Casualties mount steadily. The German army bends, but does not break. As autumn approaches, the battlefield becomes even more punishing. Rain falls incessantly. Trenches flood. Mud deepens until men sink to their knees or waist. Equipment is lost. Horses drown. Wounded men slip beneath the surface and disappear. The effort required simply to exist becomes overwhelming. Despite everything, the fighting continues. Village by village, ridge by ridge, gains are measured in yards. Each advance is paid for with blood. Each victory is temporary. The Somme becomes a symbol not of triumph, but of endurance pushed beyond reasonable limits. For those at home, the reality is filtered through communiques and headlines. Reports speak of bravery and determination. Casualty lists grow longer, names more familiar. Entire towns mourn together. The war reaches into homes and hearts, making the cost unavoidable. By the time the offensive finally winds down, the ground won is small. The cost is immense. Hundreds of thousands of men are dead, wounded, or missing on both sides. The Somme has not broken the stalemate. It has deepened it. And yet, the battle changes the war in ways that are not immediately visible. Armies learn grim lessons about firepower, coordination, and the limits of human endurance. Technology inches forward. Tactics evolve slowly, painfully, written in blood across the fields of northern France. For the soldiers who survive, the Somme becomes a defining memory. The sight of men walking calmly into gunfire, the sound of machine guns cutting them down, the feeling of helplessness, of being caught in something far larger than oneself. These memories will linger long after the guns fall silent. The Somme proves that sheer sacrifice cannot force victory. It exposes the brutal arithmetic of industrial war, where courage and suffering are consumed in vast quantities with little return. It is a warning that the war's logic has become detached from human cost. As winter approaches once more, armies dig in again, exhausted and battered. The Somme fades from headlines, but not from minds. Its lessons hang heavy over every planning room, every trench, every conversation about what comes next. Because even after all this loss, the war remains unresolved. The front lines still stretch across Europe. The guns still wait. And as leaders search for the next decisive move, the men who survive the Somme know one thing with chilling certainty. Whatever comes next will demand Chapter 13, 1917, Revolution, Submarines, and a World Transformed. The year begins not with hope, but with exhaustion. Across Europe, soldiers brace themselves against another winter, boots frozen, lungs burning in the cold air, minds dulled by years of relentless violence. Civilians ration food, queue for hours, and read casualty lists that feel endless. Governments speak of victory, but their voices sound thinner now, strained by the weight of promises already broken. 1917 does not arrive as a fresh chapter. It arrives as a reckoning. On the Western Front, the lines still hold, scarred and unchanged. The trenches are deeper now, reinforced and familiar in their misery. Men know the routines too well. Stand to at dawn. Repair wire. Endure shelling. Wait. The war has become a grim occupation rather than an adventure, and patience is wearing dangerously thin. Commanders search desperately for a way out. In France, A new offensive is planned with bold claims of decisive breakthrough. Artillery is massed once again. Confidence is projected outward, but doubt simmers beneath the surface. When the attack comes, it unfolds with tragic familiarity. The bombardment fails to destroy defenses. Infantry advances stall under machine gun fire. Casualties soar. The promised breakthrough never materializes. This time, something different happens. French soldiers begin to refuse. Not en masse, not openly at first, but quietly. Units decline to advance. Men stay in their trenches when ordered forward. They are not cowards. They are not traitors. They are exhausted beyond endurance. They will defend their positions, they say, but they will not march into certain death again. Mutiny spreads through the French army like a whispered truth. Discipline phrase. Officers struggle to maintain authority. The French command responds with a mix of repression and reform. Some mutineers are punished harshly. Others are quietly reassigned. Conditions are improved where possible. The army does not collapse, but it bends dangerously close to breaking. Across the lines, Germany faces its own crisis. The blockade imposed by the Allies is slowly strangling the nation. Food shortages worsen. Civilians grow hungry. Children weaken. Morale erodes on the home front. Leaders feel time pressing in on all sides. They believe the war must be decided soon, or Germany itself may not survive. It is in this atmosphere that Germany makes a fateful decision. Submarine warfare, once limited, is unleashed without restraint. U-boats are ordered to sink all shipping approaching enemy ports, civilian or military, neutral or belligerent. The logic is brutal but clear. If Britain can be starved into submission before new enemies intervene, the war can still be won. The oceans become killing grounds. Merchant ships vanish beneath the waves without warning. Sailors are thrown into icy water. Some cling to wreckage. Many drown unseen. Cargoes of food, fuel, and supplies sink to the seabed. News of these attacks spreads rapidly, carried by newspapers and rumor alike. Across the Atlantic, anger grows. The United States has remained neutral for years, trading with both sides, watching the conflict with increasing unease. Now, American ships are being sunk. American lives are being lost. Public opinion shifts sharply. The war no longer feels distant. It feels personal. Then comes the telegram. Intercepted and decoded, it reveals a German proposal to Mexico, an offer of alliance should the United States enter the war, promising the return of lost territory. When the contents are made public, disbelief turns to outrage. Any remaining illusions of neutrality evaporate. In April, the United States enters the war. The declaration is momentous, not because American soldiers immediately flood the front. They do not, but because the balance of power shifts irrevocably. Germany has gambled that it can win before American strength can be fully brought to bear. The clock begins ticking faster than ever. While the West trembles and the Atlantic burns, the East undergoes a transformation far more profound than battlefield maneuvers. Russia is collapsing. Years of war have hollowed out the empire. Soldiers are hungry, poorly supplied, and deeply disillusioned. Cities face severe food shortages. Factories strike. Peasants revolt. The Tsar's decision to personally command the army has tied his fate directly to military failure. Confidence in the monarchy drains away. In Petrograd, protests erupt. Women demand bread. Workers join them. Soldiers sent to restore order refuse to fire, then turn their weapons on officers instead. The streets fill with crowds shouting for change. Authority dissolves with stunning speed. The Tsar abdicates. An empire that has existed for centuries collapses almost overnight. A provisional government takes power, promising reform, freedom, and continued commitment to the war. But its authority is fragile. Power is divided. Soviets, councils of workers and soldiers, emerge alongside the government, challenging its legitimacy. The country exists in a state of uncertainty, suspended between worlds. At the front, Russian soldiers sense the change instantly. Discipline evaporates. Desertions soar. Men debate politics openly in the trenches. Orders are questioned. The will to fight fades rapidly. The army that once held vast stretches of the Eastern Front begins to dissolve from within. Germany watches closely. Opportunity glimmers. With Russia weakened, perhaps the war can still be won decisively in the West. German leaders support efforts to further destabilize Russia, facilitating the return of revolutionary figures long exiled. The gamble succeeds. By autumn, a second revolution erupts. The provisional government is overthrown. A new regime seizes power, promising peace, land, and bread. One of its first acts is to seek an end to the war. Russia begins to withdraw. The Eastern Front collapses not with a final battle, but with a political decision. Vast territories are ceded. Millions of soldiers simply go home. Germany suddenly finds itself freed from a two-front war, at least temporarily. Divisions are transferred westward. A final, massive effort begins to take shape. But this victory comes with consequences no one fully grasps yet. The Russian Revolution does not merely remove an enemy. It introduces a new ideology into the world, one born from war, deprivation, and rage. The shockwaves will travel far beyond the battlefield. Back on the Western Front, the arrival of American forces is still more promise than reality. Training camps fill. Ships cross the Atlantic under constant threat. Fresh soldiers arrive in Europe wide-eyed, energetic, and untested. Their presence alone lifts Allied morale. For the first time in years, there is a sense that time may be working in their favor. German soldiers feel the opposite. They know the Americans are coming. They know the blockade tightens daily. They know this year must decide everything. The war's character shifts yet again. It is no longer simply a struggle of endurance between exhausted empires. It becomes a race, Germany against time, the Allies against exhaustion, the world against the consequences of its own unraveling. Civilians everywhere feel the strain acutely. In Germany and Austria-Hungary, hunger becomes widespread. In Britain and France, grief becomes routine. In Russia, chaos reigns. In America, factories roar to life, converting an industrial giant into a war machine almost overnight. The idea that the war might end through negotiation fades. Too much blood has been spilled. Too many sacrifices demand justification. Leaders speak in absolutes now. Victory or ruin. Nothing in between. By the end of 1917, the war has transformed the world more profoundly than any battlefield map can show. Empires have fallen. New powers have risen. Entire societies have been bent and reshaped by violence and loss. And yet, despite everything, the fighting continues. German armies prepare for one last, desperate gamble. Allied forces brace for impact. American soldiers train for battles they cannot yet imagine. The world stands on the edge of another storm, knowing that whatever comes next will decide not just the war, but the shape of the century to follow. The old world has already been torn apart. What remains now is the question of what will rise from its ruins, and how much more blood it will take to get there. Chapter 14. The Final Gamble. Offensives, Collapse, and the End of the War. The ground trembles once more before dawn, but this time the sound is different. It is sharper, more deliberate, a rolling thunder that moves with purpose rather than endurance. For years, artillery has been used to grind and punish. Now it is used to deceive, to shock, to open doors that have been sealed since the war began. Across the Western Front, German guns erupt in carefully timed waves, shells screaming overhead in patterns designed to blind, disorient, and paralyze. Gas shells burst silently among the chaos. Telephone lines are severed. Dugouts are smashed. When the bombardment lifts, new kinds of soldiers move forward, slipping through the smoke like shadows. Germany has launched its final gamble. By early 1918, the stakes could not be higher. The war in the East is over. Russia has fallen away, leaving Germany briefly free from the nightmare of a two-front war. Divisions have been rushed west by rail, men hardened by years of fighting, commanders determined, to end the war before American power fully arrives. The blockade tightens daily. Hunger stalks German cities. Morale frays at home. This spring, victory must be seized, or everything will collapse. The attack is unlike anything the Allies have faced before. Instead of massed waves advancing across open ground, small, highly trained units infiltrate weak points, bypassing strongholds and striking command centers, artillery positions, and supply routes. It is fast, fluid, terrifying. Allied defenses buckle under the sudden pressure. Entire sections of trench lines are overrun before defenders fully understand what is happening. For the first time in years, the front moves. British and French units fall back in confusion, retreating across ground soaked with memories of earlier battles. Villages once fought over at horrific cost are abandoned in hours. Refugees stream westward once more, carrying children and possessions through landscapes that have already been destroyed too many times. The sense of crisis is immediate and profound. Paris feels threatened again. The war, long frozen, has suddenly become unpredictable. German soldiers advance with grim determination. Many believe this is their last chance to go home alive. They march through shattered fields and capture trenches, seeing evidence of years of stalemate slipping behind them. Some press forward relentlessly. Others pause, exhausted, distracted by abandoned supplies and food. Discipline strains as hunger and fatigue intrude, even on victory. The Allies scramble to respond. Communications are chaotic. Reserves are rushed forward. Commanders argue, coordinate, adapt. For the first time, a unified Allied command structure is established, placing overall direction in a single set of hands. The urgency is unmistakable. There will be no second chance to recover if this front collapses entirely. Despite early success, the German offensive begins to falter. The deeper the advance goes, the longer the supply lines stretch. Artillery struggles to keep up. Men are worn down by constant fighting. Casualties mount rapidly, including among the elite assault units that drive the attacks forward. Gains are impressive, but not decisive. Paris remains out of reach. The Allied line bends, but does not break. And then, gradually, the momentum shifts. Fresh American troops begin arriving in greater numbers, their presence impossible to ignore. They are inexperienced, but they are numerous, well-supplied, and full of energy. Their arrival injects new confidence into exhausted Allied forces. 4 German soldiers watching endless columns of new enemies moving forward. The realization is crushing. Time is no longer on their side. As spring turns to summer, the German offensives grind to a halt. The ground gained is held tenuously, often at terrible cost. The army is exhausted. Replacement troops are younger, less trained, less resilient. Morale erodes as it becomes clear that the decisive victory promised has slipped away. Then the Allies strike back. What follows is not a single battle, but a relentless series of blows that come to be known as the final advance. Artillery, tanks, aircraft, and infantry are coordinated with a level of sophistication unseen earlier in the war. Barges move with precision. Tanks crush wire and strong points. Aircraft strafe and bomb positions behind the lines. The battlefield, once static, now surges forward again and again. German defenses begin to crumble under the sustained pressure. Units retreat in stages, fighting stubbornly but without hope of reversal. The Hindenburg Line, once thought nearly impregnable, is breached. Soldiers who have endured years of suffering sense that the end is approaching, not with triumph, but with exhaustion and inevitability. Inside Germany, the situation deteriorates rapidly. The blockade has hollowed out the economy. Food shortages worsen. Strikes spread. Civilians protest. Confidence in leadership collapses. Sailors mutiny rather than sail into what they believe is a final, pointless sacrifice. The authority of the state begins to dissolve. Austria-Hungary, Germany's key ally, is disintegrating even faster. Ethnic tensions explode into open rebellion. Entire units desert. Nations long held together by imperial force declare independence. The empire fractures along its many fault lines, collapsing from within as the war continues to drain its remaining strength. The Ottoman Empire, too, is nearing its end. Defeats mount. Territory is lost. The strain of years of war proves too much. Another ancient power slides toward collapse, reshaping entire regions even before peace is signed. On the front lines, German soldiers fight on with grim resignation. They are no longer fighting for victory. They are fighting to survive, to retreat in order rather than panic, to protect comrades as the line falls back. The sense of purpose that once drove them forward has been replaced by a quiet understanding that the war cannot be won. Allied soldiers feel something different, not joy, but cautious hope. They advance through shattered landscapes, stepping past ruins that have defined their lives for years. The guns are still deadly. Resistance is still fierce. But the direction is unmistakable. For the first time, the end feels real. Diplomatic efforts begin behind the scenes, tentative and uncertain. German leaders seek terms, hoping to avoid total collapse. Political change sweeps through the country at astonishing speed. The Kaiser abdicates. A new government forms, desperate to stop the bleeding before the nation disintegrates entirely. On the battlefield, fighting continues, even as negotiations loom. Men die in the final weeks, final days, final hours. There is no pause, no mercy granted by the approaching end. Orders are obeyed. Attacks proceed. The war demands its due until the very last moment. Then, at last, the message arrives. At 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fall silent. The sudden quiet is almost unbearable. Soldiers look at one another in disbelief. Some cheer, some weep, some simply sit down, unable to process the absence of noise that has defined their existence for years. The war is over, but the silence does not bring immediate peace. The ground remains scarred beyond recognition. Millions are dead. Millions more are wounded, physically and mentally. Entire generations have been reshaped by violence. Empires have collapsed. Borders lie in flux. Grief and trauma stretch across continents. For those who survive, the end of fighting does not mean the end of the war's presence in their lives. Memories linger. Injuries persist. Nightmares follow them home. The world they return to is not the one they left. As celebrations erupt in cities far from the front, soldiers stand amid wreckage and try to understand what they have endured. Victory feels heavy. Relief is tangled with sorrow. The cost has been too high to fully celebrate, too immense to comprehend. And even as peace is declared, another truth begins to emerge. The war may have ended, but its consequences are only beginning. The choices made in the aftermath will determine whether this sacrifice leads to stability or sows the seeds for an even greater catastrophe. The guns have fallen silent. The old world lies in ruins. And now, the future waits to be decided. Chapter 15. The Aftermath. Peace that planted the seeds of another war. The silence after the guns stop is not peaceful. It is heavy, unfamiliar, almost frightening. For men who have lived for years under the constant thunder of artillery, the sudden quiet feels wrong, like standing in a room where the air has been sucked away. Soldiers rise slowly from trenches, blinking in disbelief, ears still ringing, muscles tense for explosions that never come. Some cheer, some cry. Many do nothing at all, unable to understand that the war which consumed their entire world has finally ended. Across Europe, church bells ring and crowds flood the streets. Flags wave. Strangers embrace. The word peace is spoken with reverence, relief, and exhaustion. But beneath the celebration lies a deeper truth that few fully grasp in that moment. The war has ended, but its damage has not. It has merely changed form. The battlefield is left behind in ruins. Entire regions are uninhabitable, poisoned by unexploded shells and scarred beyond recognition. Villages no longer exist. Fields that once fed generations are cratered wastelands. Forests are reduced to splintered stumps. The land itself bears the memory of violence, a reminder that this was not just a war between armies, but a war against the world as it once was. Millions of soldiers begin the long journey home, but home is no longer the place they remember. Those who return carry wounds, both visible and unseen. Missing limbs, shattered lungs, damaged eyes, minds that cannot escape the trenches, replaying explosions and screams in endless loops. Families struggle to reconnect with men who left as boys and returned as strangers. The war follows them into bedrooms, workplaces, and quiet moments meant for rest. Hospitals overflow with veterans suffering from injuries doctors barely understand. Shell shock is still poorly recognized, often dismissed as weakness or cowardice. Men who cannot sleep, cannot concentrate, cannot function in ordinary life are expected to simply move on. Many cannot. Suicide rates climb. Alcohol becomes a refuge. Silence becomes common. Civilians, too, are transformed. An entire generation has grown up with loss as a constant presence. Almost every family mourns someone who did not return. Women who filled factories and farms during the war now face pressure to step aside. Children grow up in households shaped by grief, scarcity, and unanswered questions. Politically, the map of the world is being redrawn, but not gently. Empires that once dominated continents have collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire fractures into new nations, each carrying unresolved ethnic tensions. The Ottoman Empire dissolves, leaving behind borders drawn by outsiders who do not understand the lands they divide. In Eastern Europe, new states emerge fragile and uncertain, haunted by old rivalries and new insecurities. Germany stands at the center of the storm. Defeated, humiliated, exhausted, it faces a reckoning not just with the world, but with itself. The monarchy is gone. A new republic struggles to assert control amid revolution, economic collapse, and political extremism. Many Germans feel betrayed, not just by their leaders, but by the very idea that they were truly defeated. The war did not end with enemy troops marching through Berlin. It ended with hunger, blockade, and surrender. The bitterness lingers. The peace conference convenes amid grand halls and lofty language, but beneath the formalities lies vengeance, fear, and distrust. Victorious powers arrive determined to ensure that such a war can never happen again, and equally determined that their former enemies can never threaten them. The result is a peace shaped more by punishment than reconciliation. Germany is held responsible for the war. The declaration is absolute, final, and deeply resented. Reparations are imposed on a scale that strains belief. Territory is stripped away. Military power is sharply limited. The intention is clear: weaken Germany permanently. But in doing so, the treaty plants resentment deep into the national consciousness. Defeat becomes humiliation. Peace becomes injustice. Many who fought the war understand immediately what this means. They know that peace built on bitterness cannot last. The language of victory sounds hollow against the memory of shared suffering in the trenches. Former enemies remember moments of humanity across no man's land, and now watch politicians draw lines that promise future conflict. Meanwhile, the Russian Civil War rages on, its roots planted directly in the chaos of the Great War. Revolution has removed one empire, but replaced it with violence, famine, and terror. A new ideology rises, shaped by war and deprivation, promising a radical alternative to the old world order. The ripples will spread far beyond Russia's borders. The United States, having entered the war late, emerges powerful and confident, yet hesitant to remain entangled in European affairs. Its vision of a cooperative international order struggles against the realities of old rivalries and national ambitions. Hope flickers briefly, then fades as nations retreat into suspicion and self-interest. Economically, the war has drained Europe dry. Debt piles high. Inflation spirals. Entire industries must be rebuilt from ruins. Governments struggle to provide for citizens who have sacrificed everything. The promise that the war was fought to secure a better future begins to feel fragile, even dishonest. Culturally, the war leaves a deep scar on the human spirit. Art, literature, and music reflect disillusionment and loss. The belief in progress, reason, and inevitable improvement collapses under the weight of mass slaughter. A generation feels betrayed by leaders, institutions, and ideals that led them into catastrophe. The phrase "never again" is spoken often, sincerely, desperately. Memorials rise in cities and villages, lists of names carved into stone. Silence becomes sacred. Remembrance becomes ritual. Yet remembrance alone cannot undo what has been set in motion. Because beneath the surface, the conditions that led to war have not disappeared. Nationalism remains fierce. Borders remain contested. Grievances remain unresolved. The weapons of war have not vanished. They have evolved. The technologies born in the trenches will shape future conflicts, making them faster, deadlier, and even more impersonal. Children born after the war grow up in a world shaped by its consequences. They inherit broken economies, fragile democracies, and stories of glory mixed with trauma. They learn history through loss. They absorb resentment without fully understanding its origins. For many veterans, the war never truly ends. It lingers in memories, in bodies, in the quiet moments when the world seems too calm to be trusted. Some find purpose again. Others drift, unable to reconcile what they were taught with what they witnessed. The war has changed how humanity understands violence, power, and itself. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the warning signs begin to appear. Political extremism gains ground where despair takes root. Voices promise restored pride, renewed strength, simple answers to complex pain. Old enemies are blamed. Old myths are revived. The lessons of the war are remembered selectively, distorted to serve new ambitions. The Great War was meant to be the war to end all wars. Instead, it becomes the foundation for another. When historians look back, they see the connections clearly, how unresolved grievances, punitive peace, economic hardship, and wounded pride form a chain linking 1914 to 1939. The road to the next catastrophe is paved not with sudden decisions, but with the aftermath of this one. World War I reshaped the modern world more profoundly than any conflict before it. It ended empires, redrew maps, accelerated technology, and shattered faith in old certainties. It introduced industrialized death on a scale humanity had never imagined, and would soon repeat. The guns fell silent, but the echoes never faded. They linger in borders drawn with careless lines, in ideologies born from suffering, in memories passed down through generations. The war ended, but its shadow stretched across the century that followed. And as the world stepped forward into the uncertain future it had created, it carried with it a lesson written in blood, that peace built without understanding, without justice, without healing, is not peace at all. It is only an armistice before the next storm. Chapter 16. The Legacy of the Great War. How World War I changed humanity forever. The war is over, but the world does not return to normal. It cannot. Too much has been broken, too much reshaped, too much lost to simply resume the rhythms of the past. The Great War does not fade into history the moment the guns fall silent. It settles into the bones of nations, the minds of survivors, and the foundations of the modern world. Long after the last trench collapses and the last uniform is folded away, its presence remains, quiet, persistent, and transformative. For those who live through it, time itself feels altered. Before the war, there was a belief in steady progress, in reason guiding humanity forward, in empires and institutions that seemed permanent. After the war, that belief lies in ruins. The illusion that civilization is fragile, that it can unravel shockingly fast, becomes impossible to ignore. The 20th century begins not with optimism, but with trauma. The psychological scars are everywhere. Millions of veterans return home, carrying invisible wounds that language struggles to describe. Nightmares invade sleep. Sudden noises trigger panic. Simple crowds feel threatening. Men who once laughed easily now withdraw into silence. Families sense the change immediately, even if they cannot name it. The war has not ended for these men. It has followed them home. Societies struggle to understand what has happened to them. Terms like shell shock enter public awareness, but understanding lags far behind reality. Many veterans are dismissed as weak, unstable, or broken beyond repair. Others are celebrated as heroes, while quietly abandoned when their suffering becomes inconvenient. The disconnect between sacrifice and support breeds bitterness that lingers for decades. Women, too, find their lives permanently altered. During the war, they filled factories, offices, farms, and hospitals, proving their ability to sustain entire nations. When peace arrives, many are expected to step back into old roles, as if nothing has changed. But something has changed. Expectations shift. Demands for political rights grow louder. In many countries, women gain the right to vote, their wartime contributions impossible to ignore. The war accelerates social change even as it devastates lives. Economically, the damage is immense. Europe is exhausted. Infrastructure lies in ruins. Debt burdens nations for generations. Inflation erodes savings. Entire regions struggle to rebuild basic industry and agriculture. The financial center of gravity shifts across the Atlantic, where the United States emerges wealthier, stronger, and more influential than ever before. Global power is quietly rebalanced. Politically, the war sweeps away old certainties. Monarchies that ruled for centuries collapse in a matter of years. In their place rise fragile democracies, often lacking experience, trust, or stability. These new governments inherit societies traumatized by war, burdened by economic crisis, and divided by unresolved grievances. They are expected to deliver peace, prosperity, and justice in a world that no longer believes easily in any of those things. National borders drawn after the war reflect ambition more than understanding. New states emerge across Europe and the Middle East, celebrated as triumphs of self-determination, yet built upon unstable foundations. Ethnic groups are divided. Minorities are trapped within hostile borders. Old rivalries are frozen rather than resolved. These lines on maps will become fault lines for future conflicts. The war also changes how humanity understands violence itself. Killing has become industrial, systematic, efficient. The distance between decision and death has grown wider. A shell fired miles away can erase lives instantly. This detachment reshapes moral thinking. War becomes something that can be managed, planned, calculated, an idea that will prove catastrophically dangerous in the decades ahead. Technology born in the trenches does not disappear with peace. Tanks, aircraft, submarines, chemical weapons. These innovations are refined, expanded, and stockpiled. Militaries around the world study the war obsessively, extracting lessons and preparing for the next one. The arms race does not end. It accelerates. Culturally, the Great War leaves an indelible mark. Writers, poets, artists, and musicians struggle to express the depth of disillusionment that follows. Romantic notions of heroism give way to bitterness, irony, and grief. Literature becomes darker, more introspective. Art fractures traditional forms, mirroring a world that no longer feels coherent. The war reshapes not only politics and borders. Memorials rise in cities and villages across the world. Names are carved into stone, often in numbers so vast they blur into abstraction. These monuments become sacred spaces, sites of mourning and remembrance. Silence becomes ritual. The dead are honored not as conquerors, but as sacrifices. Yet, even remembrance carries tension. How do societies honor the fallen without glorifying the war that killed them? The phrase, "the war to end all wars," echoes bitterly through these years. It reflects both hope and denial. People want desperately to believe the sacrifice meant something final, something redemptive. They want the suffering to have purchased lasting peace. But beneath the rhetoric, fear remains. The war has taught humanity what it is capable of, and that knowledge cannot be undone. In Germany, resentment festers. The narrative of betrayal spreads, fueled by economic collapse and political instability. Many Germans struggle to reconcile their experience of the war with its outcome. They remember sacrifice, endurance, and defense, not defeat. The disconnect creates space for radical ideas to take root. The seeds of extremism find fertile ground in humiliation and despair. Elsewhere, the consequences are no less profound. In Eastern Europe, instability leads to cycles of violence and repression. In the Middle East, borders imposed by distant powers sow long-term conflict. In Russia, revolution births a new system that will reshape global politics for the rest of the century. The war's legacy stretches far beyond its formal end. International efforts to prevent another catastrophe emerge, built on the belief that cooperation can restrain conflict. Institutions are created with noble intentions, designed to resolve disputes peacefully and enforce collective security. But they are weakened by mistrust, by the refusal of key powers to fully commit, by memories still too raw to allow compromise. The mechanisms of peace prove fragile in a world still defined by fear. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Great War is the way it changes how humanity views itself. The confidence of the 19th century, the belief in inevitable progress and rational governance, is shattered. In its place emerges a darker understanding. Civilization is not a shield. Technology is not inherently benevolent. Reason does not always prevail. These realizations haunt the modern world. For those born after the war, its influence is inescapable. They grow up amid ruins and stories of loss. They inherit unresolved anger and fragile hope. They learn history not as distant myth, but as warning. The war shapes their politics, their art, their fears, and their ambitions. And yet, even amid devastation, resilience emerges. Societies rebuild. Families heal slowly. New ideas about rights, governance, and international cooperation take root. The war does not destroy humanity's capacity for growth, but it permanently tempers it with caution, skepticism, and memory. World War I becomes the dividing line between eras. Before it, the world believed in progress without consequence. After it, the world understands that progress can destroy as easily as it can build. The modern age is born not in triumph, but in mourning. The legacy of the Great War is not confined to textbooks or memorials. It lives in every subsequent conflict shaped by its lessons and mistakes. It lives in the caution of diplomats, the designs of weapons, the skepticism of citizens. It lives in the awareness that peace is fragile, hard-won, and easily lost. The war ends, but it never truly leaves U.S. It stands behind every later decision to mobilize, to escalate, to punish, to dominate. It whispers warnings that are sometimes ignored and sometimes misunderstood. It reminds humanity of the cost of arrogance, of unchecked nationalism, of alliances built on fear rather than trust. World War I did not just change the map of the world. It changed how humanity understands war, power, and itself. It shattered illusions, created new dangers, and left a legacy that shaped the entire century that followed. And as the world moved forward, carrying both memory and momentum, the shadow of the Great War remained, a silent witness to what happens when a world sleepwalks into catastrophe, and a permanent reminder that history does not forgive those who fail to learn. Chapter 17, Remembering the Dead, Memory, Mourning, and the Meaning of the War. Long after the last uniform is folded away and the last battlefield grows quiet, the dead refuse to disappear. They live on in empty chairs at dinner tables, in photographs tucked into drawers, in names whispered during moments of silence. For the generations that follow, World War I becomes not just a historical event, but a wound passed down through memory, shaping how societies understand loss, sacrifice, and the cost of forgetting. In the immediate aftermath of the war, grief is everywhere. It is not dramatic or sudden. It is slow, suffocating, and constant. Almost every family has lost someone: a son, a brother, a father, a husband. In villages across Europe, entire generations of young men are missing. Streets feel quieter. Schools feel emptier. Futures imagined before 1914 simply no longer exist. The scale of death is almost impossible to process. Millions are gone, many without graves, their bodies lost in shell holes, mud, or unmarked fields. For families, there is no place to mourn, no certainty of where their loved ones fell. Letters stop arriving without explanation. Some never receive confirmation at all. Absence becomes permanent, unanswered, unresolved. Governments struggle to respond to this collective trauma. The war has demanded sacrifice on an unprecedented scale, and now nations must find ways to acknowledge it. Memorials rise everywhere, in city squares, churchyards, schools, factories. Names are carved into stone, row after row, often so many that individual identities blur into overwhelming lists. These monuments are not celebrations of victory. They are acknowledgments of loss. Ceremonies of remembrance become central to public life. Silence is institutionalized. Bells toll. Flags are lowered. Poppies bloom as symbols of blood spilled and lives cut short. These rituals serve a purpose. They give grief structure, language, and communal recognition. They allow societies to mourn together rather than alone. Yet remembrance is never neutral. It is shaped by politics, culture, and the needs of the living. Governments emphasize certain narratives, heroism, duty, national unity, to justify the suffering endured. The dead are often framed as willing sacrifices for a greater cause. This framing comforts survivors, but also simplifies reality. It smooths over doubt, fear, and the chaotic brutality soldiers actually faced. For veterans, this gap between memory and reality can be painful. Many feel alienated by public ceremonies that do not reflect their lived experience. They remember confusion, terror, meaningless orders, and friends lost for ground later abandoned. They struggle to reconcile official narratives of glory with personal memories of futility. Some participate in remembrance reluctantly. Others withdraw entirely. The war's literature reflects this tension powerfully. Soldiers who become writers reject romantic portrayals of combat, choosing instead to describe mud, blood, fear, and loss in stark detail. Their words challenge societies eager to move on, forcing readers to confront uncomfortable truths. These voices become acts of remembrance themselves, refusing to allow the dead to be reduced to symbols. Families develop their own private rituals. Photographs are displayed prominently. Birthdays and anniversaries are observed quietly. Letters are reread until paper thins and ink fades. Parents speak to children about uncles they never met. The war becomes part of family identity, woven into stories told across generations. In some countries, remembrance is marked by pride as well as grief. Nations that emerge strengthened or unified by the war integrate sacrifice in a national identity. In others, memory is darker, shaped by defeat, humiliation, or betrayal. Germany's remembrance becomes deeply conflicted, caught between honoring the fallen and grappling with resentment toward the peace that followed. Memory becomes contested ground. The war also reshapes how societies think about death itself. Before 1914, death in war was often framed as noble, meaningful, and individual. World War I strips away that illusion. Death becomes industrial, anonymous, overwhelming. The individual disappears into statistics. This forces a cultural reckoning. How do you honor lives lost in a war that often seemed senseless? The concept of the unknown soldier emerges from this question. Tombs are dedicated to unidentified remains meant to represent all who never returned. These graves become powerful symbols, personal and universal at once. People mourn not just their own dead, but the dead of others. The unknown soldier becomes a focal point for collective grief. Remembrance also becomes a warning. The sheer scale of loss demands that the war not be forgotten or trivialized. Never again becomes a moral imperative, repeated in speeches and ceremonies. The dead are invoked as silent witnesses, urging future generations to choose peace over pride, restraint over escalation. Yet memory is fragile. As years pass, those who live through the war grow older. Their voices fade. New generations encounter the conflict through textbooks and memorials rather than experience. The emotional immediacy softens. The danger of forgetting grows, not suddenly, but gradually. Political movements exploit this fading memory. Some reinterpret the war to serve new ambitions, emphasizing grievance over caution. Others romanticize sacrifice while ignoring consequence. Memory becomes selective, shaped to justify present goals rather than honor past suffering. The landscapes of the war become sites of pilgrimage. Survivors and families travel to former battlefields, walking ground where history and grief intersect. They stand among rows of white crosses or simple markers, realizing that each represents a life abruptly ended. These places carry a weight that words cannot fully capture. Over time, nature begins to reclaim the land. Grass grows where trenches once ran. Trees rise where artillery flattened forests. But beneath the surface, remnants remain. Rusted shells, bones, unexploded ordnance. The earth remembers, even when people try not to. Globally, World War I becomes a reference point for understanding loss and sacrifice in all later conflicts. Its memory shapes how wars are commemorated, how veterans are treated, how nations speak about duty and cost. It establishes a template for remembrance that persists throughout the century. Yet remembrance alone cannot prevent repetition. The memory of the Great War does not stop another, even more devastating conflict from erupting just decades later. This failure forces an uncomfortable realization. Remembering is not the same as learning. Honoring the dead does not automatically change the behavior of the living. Still, remembrance matters. It anchors history in human experience. It resists abstraction. It insists that behind every decision, every policy, every declaration of war, there are lives that will be altered or ended forever. For those who study World War I, the dead are not distant figures. They are central to understanding what happened and why it matters. Each name carved in a stone represents a choice made somewhere, by someone, often far from the battlefield. Remembering them means acknowledging responsibility as well as sacrifice. As the century moves on, World War I remains a touchstone for how societies confront mass death. Its memorials stand as quiet interruptions in daily life, asking passers-by to pause, reflect, and remember. They do not shout. They endure. The war's memory evolves with time, but it never disappears. It resurfaces during moments of crisis, invoked as warning or justification. It lingers in language, culture, and collective consciousness. It shapes how humanity understands the price of conflict. To remember World War I is not simply to recall battles and treaties. It is to confront grief on a scale that defies comprehension. It is to accept that progress can coexist with destruction, that civilization can collapse into violence with terrifying speed. The dead of the Great War do not speak, but they are not silent. Their absence reshaped the world. Their memory challenges future generations to act with humility, restraint, and awareness of consequences. Whether that challenge is heeded remains uncertain. But as long as names remain carved in stone, as long as silence is observed, as long as stories are told, the dead of World War I continue to shape the living, reminding humanity not just of how wars are fought, but of what they cost. And Chapter 18, The world between wars. Unfinished peace and a dangerous calm. The war is over, but the tension never truly fades. Across Europe and beyond, the silence that follows the Great War feels fragile, like thin glass stretched over deep cracks. Cities rebuild, factories reopen. Children are born into a world that promises peace, yet carries the weight of unresolved grief and unfinished business. The guns have stopped firing, but the forces that led to war are still alive, reshaped rather than destroyed. In the early years after the armistice, exhaustion defines everything. Nations are physically and emotionally drained. Governments focus on rebuilding roads, railways, and homes. Soldiers are demobilized in vast numbers, returning to civilian life with little preparation and even less support. Many struggle to find work. Economies cannot absorb them easily. Skills learned in war do not translate cleanly into peace. For a brief moment, there is hope that the nightmare has finally passed. International conferences speak the language of cooperation. New institutions are created to prevent future conflict, built on the belief that dialogue and collective responsibility can succeed where alliances and militarism failed. The idea feels noble, almost urgent. Humanity wants desperately to believe it has learned its lesson. But beneath the optimism, the foundations are unstable. The treaties that ended the war were meant to secure peace, yet they instead freeze resentment into law. Borders drawn in distant conference rooms divide communities that have lived together for generations. Minorities find themselves trapped inside new states that do not welcome them. Old empires are gone, but the tensions they suppressed now surface openly, often violently. In Central and Eastern Europe, new nations struggle to define themselves. Political systems are fragile. Economies are weak. Armed conflict does not vanish. It simply becomes smaller, more localized, more chaotic. Civil wars, border skirmishes, and uprisings erupt as groups fight to shape their futures. Peace exists on paper, but instability dominates daily life. Germany remains the most volatile fault line. The new republic is born into crisis. Reparations strain the economy. Inflation spirals until money itself becomes meaningless, carried in wheelbarrows and spent as quickly as possible before it loses value again. Middle class savings evaporate overnight. Trust in democratic institutions erodes. Extremism flourishes where desperation and humiliation intersect. Veterans in Germany, like those elsewhere, feel abandoned. They fought, suffered, and returned to a nation that seems broken and ashamed. Many find comfort in paramilitary groups that promise camaraderie, purpose, and restored pride. Violence becomes normalized in political life. Street clashes replace debate. The memory of war fuels both fear and longing. Fear of chaos, longing for certainty. In France and Britain, victory brings relief, but not peace of mind. The cost has been too high. Demographic scars are visible everywhere. Missing generations, uneven gender ratios, communities permanently altered. Governments struggle to balance recovery with security. Fear of another German resurgence shapes policy, reinforcing mistrust rather than healing it. The United States retreats inward, wary of entanglement. Though economically powerful, it hesitates to shoulder long-term responsibility for global stability. Its absence weakens international cooperation, leaving institutions without the authority or unity needed to enforce peace effectively. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union emerges from revolution and civil war profoundly changed. Isolated, suspicious, and ideologically driven, it views the world through the lens of survival and struggle. Its existence challenges the established order, introducing a new kind of conflict that will define the century ahead, not just between nations, but between systems of belief. Culturally, the world between wars feels unsettled, restless. Art and literature reflect disillusionment, cynicism, and experimentation. Traditional values are questioned. Old hierarchies crumble. New freedoms coexist with deep anxiety. People sense that the world is changing rapidly, but no one is certain where it's going. Technological progress continues, driven in part by wartime innovation. Aviation advances. Communications accelerate. Industry modernizes. Yet these advances carry an undercurrent of unease. The same technologies that promise convenience and connection also hint at new forms of destruction. The memory of mechanized slaughter lingers. Politically, many nations drift toward authoritarian solutions. Democracies struggle to deliver stability quickly enough. Strong leaders who promise order, national revival, and simple answers gain support. Fear becomes a powerful tool. The trauma of the Great War is manipulated, reshaped into narratives of betrayal and rebirth. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, the world exists in a state of uneasy balance. Crises erupt and are contained. Agreements are signed and quietly violated. Disarmament is discussed, but rarely achieved. Armies shrink on paper, while military thinking continues behind the scenes. Then the global economy collapses. The Great Depression strikes with devastating force, shattering what fragile stability remains. Unemployment soars. Trade collapses. Governments flounder. Desperation spreads across continents. The crisis deepens existing grievances and accelerates radicalization. Extremist movements that once lingered on the margins surge toward power. In Germany, economic collapse becomes the final catalyst. Promises of restored greatness, unity, and revenge resonate deeply. The language of resentment transforms into political momentum. Democratic safeguards fail under relentless pressure. A path opens toward catastrophe. Elsewhere, similar patterns emerge. Militarism resurges. Expansion is framed as necessity. The lessons of the Great War are remembered selectively, distorted to justify new ambitions. Never again fades into this time will be different. The world between wars reveals a harsh truth. Ending a war does not automatically create peace. Peace requires justice, stability, memory, and restraint, all of which are fragile under pressure. The Great War ended fighting, but it did not heal the world that fought it. For those who lived through the trenches, this period feels like a betrayal. They sacrificed believing it would spare future generations. Instead, they watched tensions rise once more, hear familiar rhetoric return, sense the same forces gathering strength. Many feel powerless to stop it. The interwar years become a bridge, not between peace and prosperity, but between one catastrophe and another. They are shaped by fear of repeating the past and inability to escape it. The world moves forward, but it carries the Great War with it like unresolved grief. As the 1930s progress, warnings grow louder. Borders are tested. Treaties are broken openly. Armies rearm. Propaganda intensifies. The language of war returns, dressed in new uniforms, but driven by old impulses. The calm between wars proves to be just that, a pause, not a conclusion. And as clouds gather once more over Europe and beyond, the legacy of World War I becomes tragically clear. The war did not end a cycle of violence. It interrupted it, reshaped it, and passed it on. The world stands again at the edge, carrying the memory of trenches, gas, and mass graves, yet stepping toward another conflict with unsettling familiarity. The Great War is no longer just history. It is Chapter 19, From Warning to Catastrophe, how the Great War led to an even greater one. The warning signs are everywhere, yet the world moves forward anyway. Speeches grow sharper. Borders are tested. Armies expand quietly at first, then openly. Newspapers speak once again of destiny, honor, and national revival. For those who live through the trenches, the language feels disturbingly familiar. They have heard these words before. They know where they lead. But memory alone is not enough to stop what is coming. The Great War was supposed to be a lesson written in blood. Instead, it becomes a foundation, not for peace, but for the next catastrophe. The years following the war do not erase its causes. They amplify them. In Germany, defeat never fully settles into acceptance. The absence of foreign troops marching through the capital allows a dangerous myth to take hold, that the army was never truly beaten, that betrayal came from within rather than defeat from without. This belief spreads quietly at first, then openly, feeding resentment and rage. Veterans who remember sacrifice without victory feel robbed. Civilians who endured hunger and humiliation feel punished rather than protected. The peace is not experienced as reconciliation. It is experienced as injustice. Economic collapse deepens the wound. Savings vanish. Jobs disappear. Families fall into poverty almost overnight. Desperation strips away patience for compromise and democracy. People do not search for complexity. They search for certainty. They search for someone to blame. Political extremism flourishes in this environment. Parties that promise restoration, revenge, and unity gain traction where moderation feels weak. Crowds gather in city squares, listening to speeches that transform grievance into purpose. Old symbols are revived. Old enemies are named. The past is reshaped into a weapon. The memory of the Great War is not rejected. It is distorted. Sacrifice is honored selectively. Suffering is used to justify future violence rather than prevent it. The dead are invoked not as warnings, but as proof that the nation must never again accept humiliation. The lesson becomes not never again, but never again defeated. Across Europe, similar patterns emerge. Democracies struggle under pressure from economic instability and political polarization. Authoritarian movements promise order and strength. Militarism returns disguised as security. Expansion is framed as self-defense. Each step is justified as necessary, temporary, unavoidable. The institutions created to prevent another war falter. Agreements are violated with little consequence. Collective security proves fragile when confronted by determined aggression. The memory of the Great War makes nations cautious, reluctant to act decisively, fearful of triggering another catastrophe. That fear becomes a weakness. The Great War taught the world how devastating modern conflict could be. It did not teach the world how to stop it. Technology advances relentlessly. Weapons become faster, stronger, more precise. Armies study the failures of 1914 through 1918, determined not to repeat them. New doctrines emerge, emphasizing speed, coordination, and overwhelming force. The mistakes of trench warfare are corrected, not to prevent slaughter, but to make it more decisive. The next war will not stagnate in trenches. It will move. For those paying attention, the pattern is unmistakable. The Great War did not resolve the tensions that caused it. It rearranged them. Nationalism remains powerful. Borders remain contested. Economic inequality remains severe. Trauma remains unresolved. The pressure builds slowly, invisibly, until suddenly it is everywhere. In the East, the consequences are just as profound. The collapse of empires leaves power vacuums filled by fear and ideology. The Soviet Union, born from war and revolution, views the world as hostile and dangerous. Suspicion becomes doctrine. Survival becomes obsession. Cooperation becomes nearly impossible. In the West, faith in progress is shattered, but the desire for greatness remains. Societies oscillate between exhaustion and ambition, between remembering loss and chasing redemption. The Great War lingers in the background of every decision, shaping fears and calculations even when it is not mentioned. The tragedy is not ignorance. It is familiarity. Leaders know what modern war looks like. They know the cost. They have seen the mass graves and shattered cities. And yet, they believe that this time will be different. This time will be quicker, cleaner, more controlled. The same illusion that existed before 1914 returns, dressed in new language but driven by the same arrogance. For veterans of the Great War, the rise of militarism is unbearable to watch. Some speak out, warning younger generations of what lies ahead. Others retreat into silence, convinced that nothing can stop the cycle. Their voices compete with rallies, uniforms, and promises of restored pride. The world edges closer to disaster, not in a single leap, but through a series of small decisions, each justified, each explained, each minimizing risk while increasing danger. The process is gradual enough to feel manageable, until it is not. When war comes again, it does not feel like a new conflict. It feels like a continuation. The unresolved business of the Great War returns with a vengeance, magnified by technology and ideology. The second catastrophe does not erase the first. It builds upon it. Historians will later trace the line clearly, from the trenches of the Western Front to the ruins of another war, even more destructive. They will point to treaties that punished without healing, economies that collapsed under pressure, societies that failed to process trauma, and leaders who exploited memory instead of honoring it. World War I becomes the opening chapter of a longer story of violence, not the conclusion it was meant to be. The greatest tragedy is not that the Great War was so devastating. It is that its lessons were understood and ignored. The war showed humanity what industrialized conflict could do. It revealed the fragility of civilization, the danger of unchecked nationalism, the cost of alliances built on fear. It exposed the gap between political ambition and human suffering. All of this was known. All of it was documented. All of it was remembered. And still, the world marched forward. When the next war erupts, it will eclipse the first in scale and horror. Cities will burn from the air. Civilians will become primary targets. Genocide will be industrialized. The machinery of death first perfected in the Great War will reach its most horrifying form. The road to that catastrophe does not begin in 1939. It begins in 1919. It begins in unresolved grief, in punitive peace, in economic collapse, in wounded pride. It begins in the failure to transform memory into wisdom. The Great War casts a shadow long enough to darken an entire century. To understand World War I fully is not only to recount its battles and treaties. It is to recognize it as a turning point where humanity glimpsed the future and chose not to turn away. The men who died in the trenches did not die for another war. They died believing their sacrifice might prevent one. That belief makes what followed even more tragic. World War I did not simply end. It echoed. It echoed in speeches and uniforms, in flags and marches, in borders redrawn and grievances left to fester. It echoed in the silence of memorials and the roar of new armies assembling. It echoed until the world found itself once again at war, proving that forgetting is not the only danger. Misunderstanding is just as lethal, and as the century marched forward, carrying the weight of two world wars, the Great War remained at the center of it all. The original fracture, the first collapse, the moment humanity learned how to destroy itself on an industrial scale. The tragedy is not that the lesson was too subtle. The tragedy is that it was impossible to miss. Chapter 20. The Great War Remembered. Why World War I still matters today. The world moves forward, but it does not leave the Great War behind. Long after the last veteran has passed, long after trenches have been reclaimed by grass and forests, the conflict still shapes how nations think, how societies fear, and how humanity understands itself. World War I is not a distant relic of a forgotten age. It is a living presence, woven into the foundations of the modern world, quietly influencing decisions made more than a century later. Every generation inherits its consequences, whether it recognizes them or not. The political map we live with today carries the fingerprints of the Great War. Borders drawn in haste and compromise continue to define conflicts, identities, and grievances. Nations born from its aftermath still struggle with questions of legitimacy, unity, and memory. Regions destabilized by its collapse remain fragile. When tensions flare in Eastern Europe or the Middle East, they often trace their origins back to decisions made in the war's shadow, lines drawn without understanding the people who would live behind them. The war also changed how power is exercised. Before 1914, war was still imagined as something limited, something that could be controlled by diplomacy and ended by decisive battles. The Great War shattered that illusion. It revealed that modern conflict is total, consuming economies, populations, and moral boundaries. This realization reshaped military doctrine, foreign policy, and international relations for the rest of the century. Every later war is fought with World War I in mind, either as a warning to avoid stalemate or as a problem to be solved through speed and overwhelming force. The tanks, aircraft, and strategies that dominate modern warfare are all descendants of the desperate innovations born in the trenches. Even the concept of total war, where civilian life becomes inseparable from military effort, originates here. The psychological legacy is just as profound. World War I marked the moment humanity lost its faith in automatic progress. The idea that science and industry would inevitably improve human life died in the mud of the Western Front. Technology proved it could destroy as efficiently as it could build. That awareness still shapes how we view innovation today, infusing optimism with caution, hope with fear. The war also changed how societies understand trauma. The experiences of soldiers shattered old ideas about courage and weakness. Shell shock forced the world to confront the reality that the mind can be wounded as deeply as the body. Though understanding came slowly and imperfectly, the foundations of modern mental health awareness were laid in the aftermath of this conflict. Today's conversations about post-traumatic stress trace their lineage directly back to men who returned from the trenches unable to explain what the war had done to them. Culturally, World War I continues to speak through art, literature, and memory. Its poets and writers stripped away romantic illusions of war, replacing them with stark honesty. Their voices still resonate, reminding new generations that violence does not cleanse or elevate, it scars. The tone of modern storytelling about conflict, skeptical and human-centered, owes much to the Great War's witnesses. Remembrance itself becomes one of the war's most enduring legacies. The rituals of silence, memorials, and collective mourning established after 1918 shape how the world honors the dead to this day. These acts are not about glorifying battle. They are about acknowledging loss, preserving memory, and resisting the temptation to forget. Every moment of silence observed today echoes the grief of that generation. Yet remembrance carries responsibility. To remember World War I is not simply to honor sacrifice. It is to confront uncomfortable truths about how easily societies drift toward catastrophe. The war did not begin with hatred alone. It began with complacency, arrogance, fear, and the belief that problems could be managed without consequence. Those same forces still exist. The Great War reminds us that alliances meant to preserve peace can accelerate destruction, that nationalism can turn pride into poison, that leaders can mistake rigidity for strength. It shows how quickly a chain of decisions can escape control, transforming crisis into catastrophe before anyone fully understands what is happening. This lesson is especially relevant in a world still shaped by global interdependence. Economic systems are tightly linked. Political decisions ripple across borders instantly. Communication is faster, not slower. The potential for misunderstanding and escalation has not vanished. It has multiplied. World War I stands as a warning carved into history, showing what happens when cooperation fails and fear takes the lead. The war also challenges how we think about responsibility. It resists simple villains and heroes. No single nation caused it alone. No single decision explains it fully. It was the product of systems, assumptions, and choices made over decades. That complexity matters because it reminds us that preventing catastrophe requires more than condemning the past. It requires understanding how ordinary decisions accumulate into disaster. For individuals, the Great War remains deeply personal, even generations later. Families still tell stories of ancestors who never returned. Names on memorials still match names in family trees. The war lives in inherited silence, in traditions shaped by absence, and values passed down quietly. It is not abstract history. It is remembered loss. And yet, the war also reveals humanity's capacity for endurance and adaptation. Amid unimaginable suffering, people found ways to survive, to support one another, to retain fragments of dignity and compassion. Acts of kindness persisted in the darkest conditions. That resilience is part of the legacy, too, a reminder that even in catastrophe, humanity does not disappear entirely. The Great War matters because it stands at the crossroads of the modern age. It marks the moment when the old world collapsed and a new one emerged, fractured, uncertain, and dangerous, but also capable of change. It explains why the 20th century unfolded as it did, why peace proved so fragile, and why memory became such a powerful force. It also reminds us that history does not move in straight lines. Progress is not guaranteed. Stability is not permanent. The world before 1914 believed itself advanced, rational, and secure. It was wrong. That realization should inspire humility in every generation that follows. World War I endures not because of its battles alone, but because of the questions it forces us to ask. How do societies prevent fear from overriding reason? How do leaders balance power with restraint? How do nations remember sacrifice without repeating the mistakes that made it necessary? These questions remain unanswered, not because they are unimportant, but because they are difficult. The Great War stands as proof that forgetting is dangerous, but so is remembering without understanding. Memory must lead to wisdom, not nostalgia or resentment. Otherwise, history becomes a weapon rather than a guide. As the world faces new crises, new tensions, and new uncertainties, the shadow of World War I remains relevant. It warns against sleepwalking into disaster. It cautions against believing that war can be controlled, limited, or contained. It reminds us that once unleashed, violence reshapes everything it touches. More than a century later, the Great War still speaks. It speaks through the borders that define nations, through the institutions created to prevent conflict, through the memorials that demand silence, through the stories that refuse to fade. It speaks as a warning, a lesson, and a responsibility. To remember World War I is not simply to look backward. It is to look forward with clearer eyes. Because the greatest danger is not that humanity will repeat the past exactly as it was, but that it will repeat it in new forms, believing itself immune to the same mistakes. The Great War showed what happens when that belief takes hold.